Thank you so much for joining me here at the Real ResQ Podcast, powered by Vertical Magazine's Helicast. You guys can go to helicast.com to check out all of your vertical podcast network. Hangar Z, the Helicopter Podcast, Valor Flight Crew Podcast, and all Vertical MRO Podcasts. Again, that's verticalhelicast.com. Now let's take a shout out to our sponsors for this episode, Airbus, pioneering sustainable aerospace. Check them out at airbus.com. Centum, LifeSeeker, the airborne phone location system. Check them out at centum.com. Metro Aviation, their mission is to provide the safest and highest quality aircraft operations, completions, and maintenance. Check them out at metroaviation.com. Axness, their mission, wireless intercom. Check them out today at axness.com. And I always want to shout out Ready Bar. Go to getreadybar.com to get your ultimate meal replacement bar. And the Real ResQ Store. Get all your swag at the Real ResQ Store and support this podcast. All right, now it's time to get into the episode. Here are a few fun facts about our next upcoming guest. He is part of a team that has their own podcast. That podcast is called So There I Was Podcast. I was honored to be a guest, and I was actually episode 156. I will actually add the description of the episode here in the write-up. So if you want to go check it out, please do. He turned 21 in Somalia at the start of Operation Restore Hope. He had circumnavigated the globe by the age of 23. And for 5 years in a row, he cooked 3 turkeys, all simultaneously, at the air station for the entire duty section and their families. That included group personnel, 2 full ready crews, plus the entire engineering section. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the show, Mr. John Hall. My name is Jason Quinn. I am United States Coast Guard Rescue Swimmer number 500. These are my rescues and rescues from those of us that put our lives on the line every day so others may live. This is the Real ResQ Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Real ResQ Podcast. Today I've got a very unique guy because he started somewhere in the Coast Guard Academy. Then he went to be a Coast Guard pilot, flying the H-65 Dolphin. He's then gone to paramedic and then went to RN and is now an APRN, which is kind of like a physical assistant. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John B. Hall, call sign Sticks. What's up, dude?
What's up? Thank you for having me aboard. It's great to be here. So, it's kind of funny, just sort of thinking back to where I am now and what I'm doing with my life. Just the other day, I'm in the emergency room and there's this guy that comes in wearing pretty much nothing but a pair of overalls and work boots. He's got a bunch of bee stings on one side and first-degree burns on the other, on his upper torso, that is. And I'm saying to myself, how the hell did this happen? And he looks at me and he goes, I was trying to get rid of a beehive. And so when I went to go light up the gasoline, and all of a sudden the gasoline came up and then there was another hole for the beehive and then the bees came out and got me from the other side. And he goes, but it's all the gasoline's fault. And I'm like, well, what do you mean it's that? And he goes, well, he's like, I would have used something else instead. And I'm like, well, what's that? Gunpowder, of course. And, such is life in New Hampshire. So.
Oh my God, dude.
Yeah, just another day in the emergency room. So.
I remember my emergency room time. I freaking loved it. And you never knew what would come through that door. And you're like, and actually, there's a couple of things that stand out to me with the emergency room stuff is that there are people that go into the emergency room that you're like, you should be screaming in pain right now. And they're like, yeah, it's a little cut. No, that little cut needs like 30 stitches, bro.
Right.
And then there are other people that come in with a paper cut, and I need every drug you could possibly give me. And you're like,
and I've got the story.
God,
I've got the story for that. I got a perfect story for that.
Take it, run with it.
All right,
so go.
So I got this guy that came in. I'm working at a different ER, and but this guy that came in who had lacerated his hand on his snowboard. He probably needed about 15 to 20 stitches. And he's like, I went to go grab the lidocaine before I stitched him up. And he literally, like, I had stitched him up with, he said, oh, you don't need to use lidocaine. So I stitched him up without the lidocaine. He did not flinch. Now, that's not the point of the story. Point of the story is that he came in about 10 days later, and I'm on duty in the ER. And he's now like flown off of the trail, done like a 180-degree flip, and his back hit a tree. And he's like clearly like a multi-system trauma, so I'm looking at, he's like a trauma from the word go. And as I'm talking to him, he says to me, he's like, I am in the worst pain of my life. And I'm sitting there going, that all of a sudden gives me totally new context because he's telling me he's in pain, and I stitched this guy's hand up without any lidocaine, not even like 10 days ago. And his injuries were so severe. He had like a head bleed, couple of cervical vertebral fractures, a pneumothorax on one side, hemopneumo on the other, liver lac, splenic lac. He was a train wreck. So he got packaged and shipped out. But then, by contrast, you got I had another case with another woman who came in who literally she's 78 years old. She's out skiing with her family. She takes a fall, injures her hip, and she skis the rest of the way down to the mountain, sits 8 hours in the lodge, and says to the family as she's driving home with them, can we stop at the hospital so I can just have somebody take a look at my hip? It's kind of bothering me. So she comes in, we x-ray her hip, and she's got a fractured hip. She skied down half of the mountain with a fractured hip. And then I've got in the bed next to her this kid who's got like a small laceration. And I ask, and he's screaming like bloody blue murder. And I ask her, like, okay, what can I get you for pain? I was like, oh, maybe just some Tylenol, but that boy next door, I think he really needs your attention. And I'm like, and so that story there probably fits more of what you were talking about, but that the paradox of pain and how people perceive pain, how they understand pain, and what that tells them and what it tells you as the clinical provider. And, one of the lessons that I learned out of that is something that I refer to as POOP, which is pain out of proportion to presentation. And that is a red flag. Wow. That is a red flag sign. So when somebody comes in and they have what I refer to as poop, that's a red flag sign. And, when somebody comes in and they have that, if you're a clinical provider, you're a nurse, you're a medic, and you think there's something genuine about it, of course, some people are going to try and BS you, but that's something you want to look for. And, so it's just one of those many lessons that I've learned along the way.
That's crazy.
Doing stuff like this.
Can I share a story that I have of a guy that came in? So I remember this very vividly because it was just a cool story. This older gentleman who was he was a Vietnam vet. He came in with a very low heart rate, and he said he was outside. He had been stacking wood, and he was like, "Man, I'm just out of breath, and I feel tired." And mind you, he's like swinging an axe to split the wood, then picking it up and stacking the wood for him and his wife. He goes inside to his wife and says, "You know what? I'd like to go to the hospital." And she's like, "Okay, let me get my things." Takes some time, does her thing. He ends up driving himself to the hospital with her, but somewhere in there, they needed to stop to do something. Then they roll into the hospital, and he sits down. I kid you not, his heart rate was like a 38. We're like, right. Holy shit, dude. Yeah. He's like, I just feel a little sluggish and a little out of breath. We're like, oh. Yeah. And then he's like, Okay, can I go back to work yet? I gotta finish stacking that wood before nightfall.
Was he having a STEMI or something?
No, I think I think it was something to do with the medication off the top of my head, but
okay, it's probably a beta blocker. He was probably overloaded on a beta blocker.
I don't know if he was over. I'm not. I don't remember
the term that would be used is super therapeutic.
There you
go.
So
in other words, he had too much beta blocker on board, and that was suppressing the heart rate from ramping up.
Yeah.
So
dude, it was awesome. Give him a little atropine.
Yes, atropine. Well, in the case of if he's not on a beta blocker, atropine would be given. Would potentially be given for bradycardia, for symptomatic bradycardia. But if there's a beta blocker on board, you actually need to reverse the beta blocker, which is a different mechanism, because realize that what the atropine is doing is it's a parasympathetolytic. Okay.
Big word, deep. But I like that. I like that.
So that
remember, you're talking to a medic and a lot of other medics that are out there. So
right.
Let it ride. Because there are a lot of other people that are not, so we're good.
That's blocking the parasympathetic side, which is suppressing the heart rate. So
sick. Yeah, that's awesome. I remember giving this guy atropine. And
so he probably did not have a beta blocker on board, but was probably headed for a pacemaker.
Yeah. Okay.
My guess is he probably, if he had some vascular disease or something like that going on, then it would probably be on the anterior descending artery. So.
Wow, dude, you just went really deep with that. I appreciate that. That's good.
That's okay. I'm going to try to avoid going into the weeds, and I'll apologize in advance, but that's not what we're here for. But
whatever, let it ride, dude. Like I said, I'm okay with it. So, all right, so you're working in an ER now, but you have such an interesting background. Like, let's start with where are you from, and what brought you to the Coast Guard? Let's go with that route.
Right. So I started off actually with also a very different name, John Smith at the time. And I grew up in Bethel, Connecticut.
Wait a minute, hold on. You started out with John Smith and now you're John Hall?
Yeah. So
okay. There's a story there.
My mom's maiden name was Hall. And I got tired of the Pocahontas jokes and credit cards being created under my name. So I decided to differentiate my name a little bit, and I just added Hall on. So my full legal name's John Benjamin Smith Hall, and I just go by Hall now. So anyway, nice. But that happened before I got married. So I grew up in Bethel, Connecticut, and was heavily involved in the Scouts and the outdoors. I earned my Eagle Scout. I did not go to the Coast Guard Academy, but that's okay. I actually went to the wrong academy. I went to the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, we actually compete directly with the Coast Guard Academy when it comes to sports and events and stuff like that. But we're one of the 5 Federal Service Academies. A lot of people don't know that there are 5 Federal Service Academies. You have the big 3, which is Air Force Annapolis and West Point. And then you have the Coast Guard Academy. And then there's this one little academy that nobody knows about that actually is older than the Air Force Academy, which is Kings Point. And that's where, honestly, this whole journey of mine started. So it was interesting when I was in high school. I had decided I wanted to go to a service academy, just before high school, actually coming out of junior high school and going into high school. I decided I wanted to go to a service academy. I was not a high performer. Okay. In fact, I will be the first to confess I had an IEP, or what's called an individualized education plan. So I was in the special ed system. But what happened was I had made mention of this to one of my English professors or teachers in high school. And he had said to me, he looks at me and he goes, I had already worked with him for about 3 months. And he just said to me, he's like, "You're not academy material. You'll never make it." And
challenge accepted.
Yes.
Thank you. Motivation set. Let's and go.
He threw down the gauntlet. He threw down the gauntlet, and apparently the thing that it flipped a switch, and my drive to, and basically it took a lot of work. It took a lot of work to actually get to a point where and I still wasn't like at the top of my class. I was average, but I was diverse in my background. I was involved with scouting. I was involved in sports. I wrestled in high school. And I was, all sorts of everything that ended with an ing: rock climbing, sailing, scuba diving, snorkeling, swimming, all of those, all of those adrenaline junkie sports. I was totally into all of that stuff. And, was volunteering at had actually not volunteered, but I worked at a summer camp, and was on the ropes course. Actually was sort of the lifeguard for the ropes course.
Oh, that's awesome.
So kid gets caught up in the ropes and everything. I would run over, climb over. I would be sitting in the ropes course for the better part of the day and go over, attach all the cords and stuff, or the ropes that needed to be set up we had a rig set up so that we could quickly get them down and basically disentangle them and then get them down off the ropes course safely. So, and that's where that sort of started, maybe those were my first rescue cases or whatever.
You know what? Approved. It counts.
Yeah. And so I had applied to Naval Academy, Coast Guard Academy, Merchant Marine Academy, Maine Maritime Academy, New York Maritime Academy, and Mass Maritime Academy. You can pick up the theme. If it had to do with going on the sea, I probably applied for it. So, I ended up I did not stand a chance of getting into the Coast Guard Academy. Coast Guard Academy is the hardest of the 5 service academies to get into.
Is it really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, it's by sheer volume of people applying and for the number of slots available. And the other thing is that the Coast Guard Academy, and I don't know why this is, I should know why, but they do not need a congressional or senatorial nomination to go there. Whereas the other 4 schools, you have to be appointed by a senator or representative before you can apply to the academy. So they have a much bigger pool of applicants, and you've got 200 slots. So
really,
and that's sort of, about 250 slots for appointments for each class. So It's pretty small.
Dang.
So Kings Point is about the same, about another 200 to 250 appointments versus the other 3 academies, which typically admit between 12 to 1,500, or maybe put out 12 to 1,500, acceptances, and maybe get a class about 1,200. So it's, and what's unique about Kings Point, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail because that's obviously not what people are here to talk about, but it's a commissioning program, a 4-year curriculum, 4-year bachelor's degree program, plus you're taking a year off to go out at sea, your sophomore and your junior year. So, and basically I was a deck major, so I majored in navigation and transportation with a minor in engineering. So I sailed 100 days in the engine room, 200 days on deck, but I learned navigation, learned how to use a sextant, did celestial navigation, electronic navigation, took apart diesel engines, put them back together, stuff like that. It was I loved it. Yeah. It was a lot of fun. Look, Kings Point was a crappy place to be because you're constantly learning through a fire hose. But it's a great place to be from. So.
Oh, right on. Yeah, right. So you get into the academy and then you get through that. At what point are you, because you were actually, you did some medicine. You were like a volunteer EMT and stuff while you were in the academy, right?
Right. So the academy, one of the unique things about let's step back for a second, talk briefly about the Merchant Marine. You're the jack of all trades and the master at none. If your ship breaks down at sea, nobody's coming out to fix your ship. If somebody gets hurt on the ship, nobody's coming out. Maybe the Coast Guard or maybe a PJ will be coming out to try and help you. Or you might be able to get, medical direction from somebody who is on shore and telling you what you should be doing. So that's one thing that you might be getting. But otherwise, it's yo-yo. You're on your own. And
yo-yo.
So you have to learn all of these skills.
Yo-yo. I'm really excied about some of these acronyms that are getting thrown out.
There'll probably be more to come.
John.
Yeah. So you've got, you end up learning, or you ended up, you had the opportunity at the academy to take an EMT class, and I jumped at it. I was like, yeah, you know what? I would love to do that. And one of the advantages is it got you out of the regular regimental watch routine. So rather than standing a deck watch where I'm going to be, watching people sign in and out, or stuff like that, I'm on an ambulance rotation. So, and I'm providing ambulance coverage for a week. So it's, and we were referred to as the geeks or the nerds. And you know what? I was okay with it. I sailed through, I loved my EMT class, picked up my EMT, ended up, that was towards the end of my plebe year. So coming in for my third class year, and, I'm now standing watch as an EMT with the Kings Point Ambulance Squad. So
the first question, what is a plebe year?
Oh, yeah. So your first year at the Coast Guard Academy, I believe they're referred to as swabs. Some of the other schools, the fourth year, your first year at the academy is always the year of abuse. Whether you're at the at Naval Academy or the Merchant Marine Academy, generally you're referred to as a plebe. The one way that I was always reminded of what a plebe was, when you looked at the name of the urinal that was used, the model of urinal that was used by Moen in the midshipman bathrooms, it was called the plebe. So there's just a constant reminder of what it is to be a plebe. And when you first get there, you're not even a plebe, you're a plebe candidate. So you have 10 weeks of abuse before you even get to get sworn in and be a plebe. That's your, and at that point, this is where they're taking you, you're in this constant game of privileges being given and taken away. And the whole, that's the other piece of the academy, is that there's a leadership laboratory there. So you're learning about, direct followership is your first year. So you're learning how to take direction. Your second year is direct hands-on leadership. Third year is intermediator or middleman management. And fourth year is, executive leadership.
Wow. Okay.
So there's that's the whole model of what the leadership laboratory is. So, in my progression through there, I go from, plebe candidate to being a squad leader, where I'm responsible for, 4 or 5 other midshipmen who are plebes. And it's my responsibility to make sure that their rooms are squared away, and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then I get to be a petty officer. When I did that rotation, I was the Master Chief Petty Officer for the regiment. So the entire school, which basically mirrored the XO. And then from there, I fleeted up to be RX, or the Regimental Executive Officer, my senior year. So,
dang, good for you. All right, so now let me circle back a little bit, because you had mentioned you got your EMT on your on 4th year of the academy, right?
Yeah, finishing my first year of the academy.
I'm sorry.
Went and became an EMTD. To date myself back far enough, EMT defibrillator qualified. So,
wow.
This would be 1990 or 91. I take that back.
Okay.
Yeah, 91.
Okay.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel old.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
You
and
still
I've got a story that goes with that too.
Okay.
So anyways, but so 91, I become an EMT basic, or at the time what they called the D, which was a defibrillator.
Okay. So right after you get go through the course and whatnot, do you remember kind of your very first call?
Oh, this is just so seared into my memory. So it's actually for INDOC. And so that's now the next, I'm no longer the bottom of the heap. So the next set of plebe candidates come in day 1. We're 18 hours into it. We have a brand new ambulance. It's so brand new that the old stretcher we had doesn't even fit in the new ambulance. So we're without a stretcher, but and we had one on order. It was supposed to be there in 5 days or so. And we're like, okay, we'll get by. It's not like anybody, we don't usually transport a whole lot of people. And I think this was the foreshadowing for what became what became with me. And that is, I have this black cloud, or the other thing that I've been also known as a shit magnet. So it's like 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and I'm like, my pager goes off, and I'm like, oh crap, I wasn't expecting a call. We're getting ready to get up for PT at like 4:30 with the plebes. And pager goes off, and I'm looking at it, and I then call this number where they have the information for us, and then we get sent to a room that's over in 4th Company, and we have these lofted racks. So apparently one of the plebe candidates had a nightmare, and he was thrashing around in the bed, and then rolled out of the bed. And in the process, he led with his head and basically hit a whole bunch of stuff on the way down, striking his head on the desk that was that was underneath the bed, a nightstand, and a chair. And I walk into this room, and there's this kid holding his head, sort of thrashing around in circles on the floor. There is blood all over the floor. Three drill instructors standing outside of the room, not knowing what to do. Just get in there. This kid's hurt. They're all pointing like, you need to go fix this. And I walk in, and I've got my partner with me, who happened to be pretty much my roommate through the entire 4 years at the academy. And at least I got my gloves on, and I'm looking. I'm like, holy crap! This kid is he's completely disoriented. He has no idea where he is. I'm not sure if that's from him waking up from sleep and still being in sort of a nightmarish state. But he has all sorts of trauma. He's got lacerations around his eye. I got one pupil that's a little bit larger than the other, but I'm also so new that I'm not even quite sure what I'm seeing. I know now that when I felt or palpated around his orbits that I felt crepitus, now that I know what it actually felt like. So he had crepitus there. Couple of teeth were broken. Fortunately, his trachea was midline, his airway's intact. Respirations were a little, tachypnic, but he was otherwise, so get in there, get his airways, make sure his airway is secure, C-spine secure, get him under control, C-collar on, board him, get him on oxygen, doing all the basic stuff that we can. I've got my basic assessment done. We're 7 minutes there. The only thing that I know at this point that I'm remembering from the back of my head, and we had a really good instructor, and he said, you run into a patient like this, they need two things, diesel and hot lights and cold steel, in other words, the OR. So
go
loaded up. The ambulance is now out front. So my my partner went and got the ambulance. So I grab a couple of drill instructors, you, and you, grab a corner. Okay, we're going to lift, get him out to the ambulance, get him loaded I open up the back of it and I go, damn it, there's no stretcher. So now I got to put him on the bench seat. So transferring him to the hospital, give a report, and then the doc starts grilling me. Like, what the hell did you guys do to him? He looks like he's been completely beaten. He thought we had beat the snot out of this kid.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So it's like, no. It did not happen that way. And the truth sort of came out later. The kid even admitted that he had a history of nightmares and I guess didn't report that, figured it wouldn't be a big deal. But he did have a small subarachnoid hemorrhage, maybe. So he had a little bit of a head bleed, broke his nose, couple of orbit fracture, but no impingement or entrapment of his eye. So First patient, day one, is a trauma patient, and it's been downhill from there ever since. So
downhill or uphill? Depends on how you look at that.
It all depends on how if you're looking for disaster.
Perspective.
Yeah, and it's what I can tell you is later on in my ER nursing career, when they would offer to when the charge nurse would want to send me out to triage to go be the triage nurse for the night, there were about 7 other people volunteering to go instead of me because they knew if I went out there, we were in for a bad night. So,
oh, that's funny.
Yeah, it is what it is. But yeah,
my gosh. Welcome to number 1.
That was patient 1, and there were a few others, there at the academy. I think, one of the other ones that sort of stands out was I was actually sailing. I raced dinghies. And I was.
Wait a minute. Okay. There's a write up on this one. This is the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah. Ooh, man, I like this. We're gonna divert real quick to thank our sponsors.
Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
So you got a memorandum here, September 27th, 1993. It's accommodation, nice little letter. There's 4 paragraphs here, but what you did was more the last 2 paragraphs. So here's what it says. I happened to be on the waterfront that morning and observed the EMT's response. This is the second time in the year that I have seen our medical personnel in action. Last spring, during the Admiral McLintock Cup Regatta, a sailor from the St. Mary's College dislocated his shoulder while in the water. In that instance, one of our sailor EMTs, Midshipman John Smith, 2C, was on scene to stabilize the injury and displayed incredible talent and compassion in doing so. In the past, I may have taken our midshipman EMT service for granted. However, after seeing these 3 midshipmen in action, they've earned my respect and admiration and made me very proud to be a King's Pointer. That was from Lieutenant Commander Eric York.
Yes.
Willis Check?
He was the director. He was the director of the waterfront. So,
man, that is cool. So what happened?
So, what I'll also just briefly, here's what happened. So I'm out sailing in the regatta, and it's the Admiral McLintock Regatta. So Kings Point.
So you're sailing. Hold on, real quick. You're sailing it. So you're racing. I'm racing in. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're a participant sailing, racing, trying to win.
I'm sailing against what is soon to be my patient.
That's funny.
What happens is he apparently, so we're in Kings Point's really well known for sailing, and we host a couple of different regattas. We're near the top of the heap in terms of schools, in terms of our racing competitiveness, and have put more than one sailor onto the U.S. Olympic team. I wasn't that good, but wow. But yeah, no, that's the level that we were at. So I'm out racing with these guys. I look over and I notice that there's this boat that's now all of a sudden up against the committee boat. And there's clearly some distress, something going on. And they haven't started the race. They've got to sort this other problem out, apparently. And it didn't look like it was a mechanical issue with the boat. So I kind of, sailed over and realized as I was getting closer that the sailor was injured. And apparently what they had said is they think he dislocated his shoulder. And I've forgotten who it was. I think it was my dinghy coach. He goes, "John, you're an EMT. Get over here." So I now have to bring my boat over, transfer from my boat to the committee boat, and then sort of make an assessment. And I realized what happened was he had taken his hand. It was trying to tighten up on something called the boom vang, which is a tensioning device that goes from the boom to the mast and flattens the sail out so that you can adjust it according to the wind speed. And in the process of doing that, he had previously dislocated his shoulder and he had popped the humerus out and it went up and then over and sort of behind the clavicle. So the challenge that became is that he could not bring his arm down at all. He was stuck at like a 90-degree angle with his arm out in front of him. So as I'm sort of looking at this, I'm going, okay. And he's on this very unstable, it's a laser, so a very unstable boat. So I've got to figure out how I'm going to get his arm stabilized and then get him off of the boat, onto the committee boat, back to the dock, and then from the dock onto an ambulance. And came up with the idea of taking some life jackets and basically building a shelf underneath his arm and then securing his arm onto the life jackets. Then had somebody grab a shortboard from the ambulance that we still had that we almost never used. Or was it? No, actually, it wasn't even a shortboard. It was the KED, the Kendrick extrication device.
Yeah.
So we had pulled that out. I didn't use it completely, but I used it to just sort of stabilize him enough so that we could get a hold of him and move him out as a unit onto the committee boat, which worked well, because now I had multiple points where people could grab onto him, and with the leg straps, he wasn't going to move or jostle around that much. Got him onto the committee boat, then get over to the dock. We basically slid a longboard in behind him and then slid him right up the longboard almost into like a standing position, and then did like a standing takedown from there. And then we're able to put him onto our stretcher. I kind of broke a rule though, and we had found out that the local ambulance was going to be delayed by like an hour to an hour and a half, and the Kings Point ambulance could respond and assist with people who were injured on the academy, but we were not supposed to transport them. But I decided that, things being what they were, that I was just going to go ahead and transport them and ask for forgiveness later. So, but that's sort of
putting the patient first.
Right. That's
oh man, I could go on a soapbox about this. I really could. So I am all about that. Making the decision for your patient. Like in all the rescue scenarios that I've ever heard anything, like what is best for the patient? Yeah,
absolutely.
There's my soapbox. So, I won't get deep into it.
but you know what? But here's what it actually dovetail into, in a way that, a big piece of what I picked up at the academy, and what, a life lesson learned at this stage in my life, if there was one thing that I was going to walk away with, and that's actually what the academy motto was, which was acta non verba, deeds, not words.
Nice.
And, and that, has held me through my entire life. The whole point of Kings Point is a service academy. We're here to serve others. And, throughout when I was the regimental executive officer, I felt it was like my job to, especially with my plebe class, I'll explain briefly what the regimental executive officer's role is at that time. And they're the primary mentor for the plebe class that's coming in. So as a senior, you're sort of providing the senior directive and guidance. So the way that I looked at it and the way that I approached it was, these were my plebes. And not that I owned them, but that I was responsible to them.
Yeah.
The same way that as an aircraft commander on a helicopter with a rescue swimmer, and when I put that rescue swimmer down, that's my rescue swimmer, whether he's in my helicopter or not. And that's my responsibility to make sure that he comes back to the air station, or my flight crew. And so when the term comes out that it's not that it belongs to me, but I'm obligated to those individuals, to that air crew.
Yeah.
So that's where that comes from.
When you brought your patient, so you took him to the hospital.
Yep.
Did you ever do a follow-up? Was everything okay?
Yeah.
With the shoulder?
He had a reduction. He actually came back he got it reduced. He was in a sling and a shoulder immobilizer, and actually was back at the academy. Both of us were out of the race, but that's okay. It wasn't a. It's okay.
This could be one of my other questions. Did you end up like a do not fishing or do not finish?
Yeah, it was a DNF. Yeah, did not finish. But that's okay.
There should be a little asterisk next to it to be like, because he's a badass and saved a life. All right, whatever.
It was so the best part of that was when he came back, he came over to me and he was very thankful. He actually gave me a hug with his good arm. so
and then one more question about that is, so you said you kind of broke a little bit of policy to get him to the hospital. Right. When you got back, was there anything, did you have to deal with anybody? Like do a debrief or anything like that with that?
So yeah, actually I completely overlooked that part of this. So
this is my assets. Like, come on, man.
So I get back, and then it was the next day, or it was Monday the following, because this was on a Saturday. It was the Monday the following. I had to go over and see our medical director, who was actually a Coast Guard officer. He was a Coast Guard Health Services officer, and he provided medical direction for the ambulance. And he was a little agitated that I had transferred this patient when we're not supposed to transport non-academy people. And he's sort of grilling me and laying into me a little bit. And then the commandant happened to be walking by. And so there was the superintendent and the commandant. And the commandant walks by, old gruff guy. But he walks in and he overhears the conversation. And he looks at this Coast Guard commander who's sort of grilling me. And he says, oh, John, I saw you. You did a great job with that shoulder down at the waterfront. Blah, blah. Just like singing my praises. And then he looks at the commander. He goes, and you were saying something about how good a job he did, right? And he just sort of looks and it like went away. It went away with that.
Yeah.
So, he was like, go back. You have other things to do, You're
dismissed.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like,
John, that's funny.
Yeah. And it was funny because I was just like, I wasn't quite like I knew what I did, and I knew that what I did was the right thing, and I was comfortable with that decision. But at the same time, I was like, I was like, you're sitting there, you're a midshipman, and I got an 05 or 06, an 05 girl in me. So
I understand the dilemma. I've been in the dilemma myself personally, where you're having to make a decision that is against some sort of a policy, some sort of a regulation, but it's the right decision to make at that moment in time.
Right.
I get it. And then,
and it's the thing is, and what I've learned along the way is that if you're going to deviate, you can deviate, but you have to have a reason for your deviation and an explanation for it.
Exactly. And it has to be an explanation that makes sense as to the why. Well, why did you do that? Oh, just because I thought. No. Right. I did my pros, I have my cons, my safety, my this, that, whatever you want to call it. Like I did my whole brief, and this is the best scenario with what I had to work with.
Right. It can't be as a matter of convenience.
Correct. Yeah. And I'm not saying to anybody out there like, oh, just make your own policy. No. Be careful with that one. Like, there's a reason regulations are set. There's a reason the protocols are in place.
Right.
But there are times when you can make an educated guess or an educated decision to make the right decision.
Right. The rationale that got me out of trouble, I guess, would be that it was, the way that I explained it was that my concern was it would be a delay in patient care. And while he did have good pulse, motor, and sensory function, I had documented in my run report that, the pulse was weak and capillary refill was greater than 3 to 4 seconds. So, so there's a concern about circulation. So,
can I throw one more of my own stories in there? Because it reminds me of something. So one of the things that I remember flying back, we picked up a lady offshore, and we had probably a 2.5 hour flight to get back to shore. In that time, she was complaining of really bad abdominal pain. And we had gone through all the stuff. Well, part of our protocols in abdominal pain is you're not allowed, or you were not supposed to give pain medication, because if there's an internal bleed, now you're covering it up, and then the hospital gets mad. Well, she was in excruciating pain. Like she was rolling on the med bed. She's like just in pain. We have like another probably hour and 40 minutes to go.
Yeah,
we talked about
the
crew. Yeah, and we didn't have radio comms with the hospital to ask for any type of direction. So we went back. We're like, look we know it's not this, or this because of this, and this. What we believe is that she's having an ectopic pregnancy, right? Where the fetus is growing inside the fallopian tube. Not good, right? So this is what we believed was going on with her. So what we opted to do is give her a little bit of pain med to kind of just relieve some of that, and in that time, and to help the flight all the way there. Our medical directors came back and said, great job. You guys did an amazing job. The write-up was amazing. We had done all of our assessments prior to that before giving that. So that's my deviation with that. Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. And that's, that's like one of the other things I teach, so I'm now currently actually at the moment, precepting a nurse practitioner, student. And,
nice.
One of the things I emphasize with her, or in any of the other times that I've been teaching or educating other healthcare providers or professionals, is that treat the patient and not the monitor.
Yeah.
Because how many times have you seen somebody get a PEA in an algorithm, like if they're getting tested or something, and then but they don't check for a pulse, and you've got a patient who's in pulseless electrical activity, and nobody's doing CPR.
Right. Not good.
So,
not good.
Exactly.
So, okay. So. We got diverted there. Let's bring it back.
No, that's okay. But each of these stories, you say this is what happens with this, though, is because each of these stories now all of a sudden brings up some other lesson learned. Yeah. And that's where the value in this is. It's like you got to learn from other people's mistakes or other people's experiences, because you're not going to live long enough to make all of those mistakes yourself.
Right. Well, one of the things that I say all the time is there's a reason they call it the practice of medicine, because a lot of stuff you're practicing to see if it works. You look at if we go way, way back in CPR, and they had no idea. And now all of a sudden we're doing chest only compressions, because they're like, this is the most important part. Breathing is kind of secondary. And oh my gosh, I got to be careful with saying that. But the
No,
standard.
you're absolutely okay to say that. And here's why.
Right.
Because when somebody is in cardiac arrest, their myocardial oxygen demands, their cerebral oxygen demands are at their nadir. They're at their lowest point. So it is more important to circulate the oxygen that is within the bloodstream than it is to necessarily provide additional respiratory support. That's what the current evidence tells us. The remaining oxygen that is already within the hemoglobin, and that's where, this is when it comes in. This is a whole nother tangent, and I won't necessarily go into it, but when it comes to teaching respiratory emergencies, to new providers, I break it down into three primary things. You have mechanical respiration, you have chemical respiration, and you have cellular respiration. And you can have respiration interrupted at any of those processes. But with CPR, what happens is you still have cellular respiration is still capable with the remaining oxygen that is in the bloodstream. Because what people should know is that, or providers that should know, is that oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, and it is the hemoglobin that is responsible for transferring the oxygen to the cells. CO2, which is also a big problem, is transferred with the water through binding with CO2 with water makes carbonic acid, which is then transferred to the lungs, where it then transfers out through the alveoli through expiration. So you're supporting cellular respiration by doing chest-only compressions.
Which is amazing. And all of that from back in the day, which they didn't even know what CPR was, to now.
Right.
And
And there's been, I was first certified in I was first certified in CPR at the age of 12. I'm now 53. I was, in order for me to compress the chest enough, I developed this technique of, like, I would be kneeling next to the patient, but then raise my knees up off the floor so that my body weight would be enough to compress the chest enough to actually get a full chest compression.
Wow.
And the instructor looked at it and said, and what it was, we were using a type of device that actually measured your depth of chest compression at that point. And he said, you've got the adequate rate and adequate compression, so it's a pass. There was a non-standard technique, but because I just didn't have, at that point, I didn't have the upper body strength to do it. But he said, and I did, he made me do 5 solid minutes of it. And he said, okay, it's, better than anybody else that's been through here today. So.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. So we got kind of diverted on a tangent here. So
I know.
Bring it back. Okay. You had mentioned you had one more kind of call out while you were in the academy that stood out.
Oh God. Yeah. This one, from a trauma perspective, is probably the sickest patient I took care of. So again, we're running an Eagle Scout camporee, and we were gone through the entire day, had scouts coming through and rappelling off of the building, not a single incident. I did a couple of events where a couple times I had to go over the side to go get a kid's t-shirt unstuck from his figure 8 descender. But we had closed up the station and we're done. They had set up a rappelling station on the back, and I had left, and then was up letting everybody know that we were done with the rappelling station. Whoever the group that we were running, it was the National Eagle Scout Association that was running the camporee. And when all of a sudden I had somebody who came running up and said, one of the midshipmen fell off the back of the building and at the rappelling station and is hurt. So I'm like, beat feet, and I was running the rappelling station. I was like, oh shit. So I'm running down there. I get down there, and there's this midshipman on the backside of the building where it was much taller. He probably had like a 30 to 35 foot screamer, but he had actually been to airborne school, so he had actually learned a PLF and managed to do a PLF, but parachute landing fall.
Okay. That's where they land, they crouch down and roll over. Yeah.
But
wow, look at that! It's been a while since I've done that too.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute. But he still had what we would refer to as Don Juan syndrome. So having all of that compressive energy as he comes down on the backside of the building, coming into his heels, fractured both of his heel bones or his calcaneus, had bilateral tib-fib fractures at the distal end, and then all of that energy now continues all the way up through the femurs and then through the pelvis. Fortunately, his pelvis did not have any injuries, but he had compression fractures of L5, L4, and S1. So the two lower lumbar vertebrae, first sacral vertebrae. And then as he was falling to the side, he had a distal radial ulnar fracture. And what was unique about this was all of a sudden I'm flashing back 3 years to my EMT class. And I remember when we were talking about trauma, we had this really kind of old school paramedic who was teaching our course. And he says to me, he talks to us and goes, he's like, let me tell you about this thing called Don Juan syndrome. And he describes this whole thing. And that's exactly what I was looking at. Like all of a sudden I'm going, this is friggin' Don Juan syndrome. And as I'm palpating down his back, as I'm getting him, I've got him collared, we're now getting him boarded. I'm so hyper focused. Unfortunately, I'm not on duty, but I did all of the initial response, get him packaged up, get him on the board. He's now off to the ambulance. Now I've got a lot of questions to answer. But I just, all of a sudden, this was the first time I think I ever really had sort of post-event stress that I kind of lost it. I was like more, I think, rage almost. It was hard. This was a really seriously injured individual, and I was helping to run this station. Fortunately I was there to help him when this happened, but yeah, and it still sticks with me to this day. That's just, wow. This is one of those, but what I can say on the upside, because I was a senior, but I did manage to follow up on him about a year later, and he actually managed to graduate. He actually got commissioned, he got an exception and a waiver, got commissioned in the Marine Corps. So,
solid.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lost track of him from there, but that's from what I understood. So.
Do you know what happened and how he fell?
So, I do. I did the investigation on this. So I was one of the things, because I was running the rappelling station, they sort of tasked, and I'm a senior, so they tasked me with the investigation of this event. And what it turns out was, the way that they had rigged it, they had taken a piece of gold line, which is, a standard rappelling line. And they had tied it to a rail that was mounted to the top of to the roof. And they had basically tied a clove hitch with the bite of the top of that gold line. And what should have been was, there should have been a carabiner passed to secure it properly. You would have passed a locking carabiner through that bite and then through the two standing parts of the line.
Yeah.
But the carabiner was not there, or nobody had verified that the carabiner was there before they started rappelling on it. So 3 or 4 people had gone before him, and that dot that had been up there, the clove hitch that had been tied there, had held. But he just happened to be the one unlucky guy that got on the line. And I was like, okay, you guys need to clean up. If you want to do a couple more runs, that's fine. I probably should have been there, and I should have been supervising more closely. But they were also the people that were managing it. So I kind of figured, well, they know what they're doing. And, so on my part, I'll take the ownership that I will take in that, is that, I failed to provide the adequate leadership and left them, or should have secured it completely and taken all the ropes down. And that's sort of, you have to live with that, but.
I appreciate the extreme ownership. I love it. And I shout out to Jocko for all of that extreme ownership that he does. I look at that a little bit differently though. And that is that you're there as an instructor and you're there to teach them, right? Once they've gotten to a point where they're supposed to know, and they're like, we all have to learn at one point or another, right?
Right.
But you have to do it and you have to take the instruction. So at one point or another, you have to hey, what part did you miss in this whole thing?
Yeah. And it's, in looking back on it, in hindsight is always 2020.
Yeah.
Especially me now having done aviation, I'd have made a checklist.
Oh yeah. God bless the checklist.
a pre-rappel checklist. And, did you run the pre-rappel checklist? And we live and we die by the checklists. And
that's good.
Yeah.
Another question. What you were in school from what year to what year?
So I actually, I graduated in class of 95.
Okay.
So basically 91 through 95 in full honest disclosure. I had a medical setback. I did my plebe year twice.
Okay.
So that's the other fun part of my experience here was that I injured my knees had a cartilage tear, which took me out of my plebe year. And then when I finished, so what happens in your plebe year, you have to get to recognition. And once you're recognized, you then become you're effectively a third class midshipman. Once the seniors graduate. If I had made it to recognition, I would have come back as a third class midshipman versus a fourth class midshipman. But I left a week before recognition. And so when I came back, I then had to repeat my entire plebe year. Twice.
Oh man. I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, it's okay.
Learn.
It is
learn
at that point.
again.
You know what happens? Like the second time you go around something like that, you realize how funny it is. If you think back to boot camp, for you guys, and you realize that the drill instructors are nothing but absolute friggin' comedians. Some of the stuff that they said, I think it was my first plebe year. I was going through Indoc. They took my rack was so unhappy with its personal appearance after I had made it that it was folded in half and shoved out through a window because it committed rack suicide. So I was given 2 minutes to run down 3 flights of stairs and carry my mattress back up and get it back on my bed and remake it. So, and I was surprised that they could fit the mattress through such a relatively small opening. They're slightly bigger than normal windows, but yeah, I was like, it was sort of one of those original moments in your academy experience. So
that's so funny.
Yeah.
All right. So when you graduate, where do you go next? Or where's your first unit? Or
so
what happens? Yeah. We're going to divert real quick to thank our sponsors.
Axnis. The Axnis PNG wireless ICS system delivers cutting-edge wireless ICS technology to any aircraft as a fully integrated system or as a carry-on, carry-off mobile base station. The PNG wireless system is the right solution for any mission.
So how did I get it? So what happens here's the cool thing about Kings Point. You can commission in any of the 5 services. You can go Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard.
That's awesome.
So in my graduating class, we were a little less than 200. 25 of my classmates went Navy flight. So for pilot, another 25 went NFO. Another 14 or so commissioned surface warfare officer. 4 of them commissioned into my roommate in particular went Navy nuke. So
cool.
A bunch of them went Navy. And then we had 3 or 4 guys that went Army. Another 2 or 3 guys went Marine Corps. 4 or 5 went Air Force. About 7 of us went into the Coast Guard. And so I was one out of, I think there were like 24 or so that applied, and they took 7. So I had commissioned with a few other people. And that was such a awesome point in my life. That was a highlight. I was going to ask, because you had appeared on our podcast, which we'll double back to later, but
yes,
I was going to ask you.
You're on a podcast.
I was going to ask you, what did it feel like when you finally pinned on those wings after finishing swimmer school? And
so convenient. Well, interestingly enough, you don't actually pin on your wings until after you're qualified. The only thing you get after graduating school is your crows. So congratulations, you're now an E4, Petty Officer 3rd Class. And I will tell you, when that day happened, it was like, we could have taken over the world. We were invincible at that point.
When you work so hard for something like that, it feels awesome.
For sure.
So so I actually did a brief period for INDOC as a summer ensign. I worked for the medical officer over there. And then actually then went to Margrad and then went to Coast Guard headquarters initially, working in the marine safety field. So, and that's where I actually ended up I did a TAD assignment to, I had the most exciting, I made my headquarters tour, which was what I referred to as my penalty tour, because I went to the wrong academy. So, you know, but I made it the most exciting Coast Guard headquarters tour you could. So while I was there, I volunteered for a fire department, and which sort of dovetails into like a whole nother set of stories. Did a TAD assignment to the Coast Guard cutter Reliance. And I got a commendation letter out of that. Basically, as an EMT, I went on board and served as an independent duty corpsman, which put me in contact with somebody who later on was a huge influence in my life and appeared on your podcast. So Andy French.
I love that guy.
His dad, Captain Arthur French, who's a Coast Guard Academy grad, went to Uniformed Services Health Science University and was a Coast Guard flight surgeon, happened to be the Coast Guard flight surgeon that I spoke to about one of our crew members on the Reliance that got injured. So,
wow.
And so I, spoke with him, and I actually remembered him, and I remembered this whole conversation that we had. And he had taught me like this amazing lesson. So we're talking, what had happened is I took a winter TAD assignment for about 6 or 8 weeks on the Coast Guard cutter Reliance, which is a 210-foot cutter, sort of filling in for the corpsman because he was going to have a kid. So basically I'm just doing basic EMT stuff in case somebody gets hurt. Well, we get stuck in a nor'easter, and got the snot beat out of us. The captain drew a circle on the chart and said, "Don't go out of this circle." And it was, we were just getting hosed and hammered. It was brutal. But we had a electrician's AETC, no, not an AETC, but an ETC. So electrician's mate or an EMC, I guess, was trying to, like, all of a sudden the ship rolled. He reached out and grabbed the hatch combing. And as the ship was rolling, the hatch actually came back and slammed onto his fingers and broke all 4 of his fingers.
Ouch. Yeah.
And he broke both the both of the proximal above and below the proximal interphalangeal joint. So when you're looking at your fingers here, the proximal interphalangeal joints, that first joint, and the distal interphalangeal joints, the one that's further out, and he broke all 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bones on all 4 of those fingers. So, I basically called over to Boston to talk with whoever was on duty that day for the flight surgeon, which happened to be Dr. French, and explained to him what I had. And so we're like, okay, we're going to give him some morphine, but then we have to make the decision of what are we going to do with him. And Captain French comes out with, well, he goes, it's all about the delta. And I'm thinking to myself, what delta? And he's like, so it's all about the difference. And he's like, we were debating about whether or not we were going to get him off of the boat now or wait until our next port of call. And the concern that we had was this was I believe it was his right hand. And with his right hand, he's right hand dominant, and he's actually about a year or so from retirement. And what I said to him was like, listen, this guy's getting ready to retire. And we probably, I think it would be better for us to consider getting him off the boat sooner rather than later, because we don't want him to have any, what we refer to as morbidity. So in other words, a lifelong disability as a result of this injury.
Right.
And, what Captain French had said to me, he goes, that was really well thought out. He goes, absolutely. Let's get him. So we ended up putting him off, I believe, in like Newport, Rhode Island. And, and it was, a day and a half later, but, so in the interim, I was just basically giving him morphine, in that time period, which was kind of unique because it was only an EMT basic. So as I'm not necessarily supposed to do that, but into the world of the Coast Guard, where I'm treating another Coast Guard person, rules of engagement are different. You know, you can pretty much do whatever the flight surgeon will tell you. So,
right.
But anyways, so yeah, so that's sort of how I initially met Dr. French. He comes into play later on in my career. Anyways, so I ended up volunteering with a volunteer fire department, Cabin John Volunteer Fire Department, and they offered to put me through paramedic school.
Oh, that's cool.
And at no charge. So I went through Montgomery County Fire Rescue Academy. And also I can't, how did I almost step over this? So I met my wife there. So my wife was volunteering for, my wife Ann was volunteering for Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad. And we both happened to be at Bloodborne Airborne Pathogens class. So
nice. Good spot to meet her.
And it was funny. So I met her there and I had talked with her and I got her phone number. And then it was like 2 weeks later, or sometime later, I'm actually, we had to go do a pronouncement on somebody who had died. And I was on the medic truck and doing my field training time. And so she's there initially, and then I showed up. So we're talking about setting up a date or something over a dead guy. So, it's just sort of one of these things. It's sort of the story of my life. But during that time, I also helped them stand up a swiftwater rescue swimmer program as well. So
that's so good. And you know what? I shout out to you for that because you actually earned yourself an award from them. And let me read this right here because this is really cool. Cabin John Park Volunteer Fire Department Incorporated. Sidney W. Earl Jr. Paramedic Training Award presented to John B. Smith. Whereas Cabin John Park Volunteer Fire Department Incorporated is committed to excellence in the fire and rescue service. Whereas the members of the employee assigned to the Cabin John Volunteer Fire Department Incorporated are among the finest in the country. Whereas it is recognized that an elite few stand surpassing the rest in their performance, which is above and beyond the call of duty. In this further recognition, that said few exemplify the traditions of honor of the fire and rescue service. Resolved, the Cabin John Park Volunteer Fire Department Incorporated shall bestow the distinction of this paramedic training award on select individuals in recognition for their commitment, dedication, and support to the citizens of the Cabin John Park Volunteer Fire Department community through their completion of the Emergency Medical Technician Paramedic Training Program. And this is dated April 1997. Well done, sir.
Yeah.
That's awesome. They're actually, again, another shout out. You actually earned yourself a service medal with all of your volunteer time between 95 and 97. And you're actually only the second guy that I've ever known to get this medal. And it's a military outstanding volunteer service medal. From the period of 1995 to 1997, during this period, you have continuously served as a volunteer EMT paramedic with Cabin John Park Volunteer Fire Department and the Montgomery County Fire Rescue Services in Potomac, Maryland. During this period, you responded to over 250 calls and volunteered in excess of 2,400 hours of service to the greater Potomac, Maryland area. Dude, that's amazing. Congratulations on that one, too. That's awesome.
The only thing I'll add on to that is that it's also in the context of working full-time at at headquarters. So it was the scheduling at that point in my life, and realized, so I met my wife, we got engaged, and but the curriculum there had me in academic classroom 2 nights a week, then doing field training 1 night a week, my regular duty shift at the station 1 night a week, and then doing the actual, what we refer to as clinical rotations. So trauma, OB, burn center, actually had to go witness 3 autopsies. What other rotation? Peds, and then just regular hours in the ER, with a primary physician preceptor. The OR for intubations. So yeah, I mean, when you to make that jump from EMT to paramedic is huge, and you know what that's like. Totally. There's a lot to process, and you're also along the way earning your ACLS and your PALS, which is a whole nother. These are like add-ons. So where for those people who don't know, where you have CPR for those people, and most people know what a CPR certificate is. There's an advanced life support certificate, and there's also a pediatric advanced life support certificate, which is your ACLS and your PALS. So it's, between all of that and then working full time and also going through the process of planning a wedding. And my wife, I think my now wife probably wanted to kill me about that time. But things happened so quickly and what was really disappointing was that I missed my graduation from the program because I was getting married. So gosh. They hadn't set the date for the graduation. And I set the date for the wedding, and it turned out that it was the same weekend. And I knew damn well there was no way I was going to get out of, I could say, can we move the wedding?
Yeah, hell no.
But, and the only thing I'll this was the first time so coming out of the academy, I learned how I learn. And I think that's an important thing for everybody to sort of get to in terms of an actual point here. And that is that, I sort of figured out that, I learned through repetition and visualization and, actual sort of concrete sequential processing of information. And whereas, the abstract and just sort of being able to read something and then reprocess that information is much harder for me to do. And I think, a lot of rescue swimmers probably learn the same way. There's that process of, as you're going through and learning how to do rescues, out of somebody that's in the water, it's there's a psychomotor element of learning that's involved. And, so it's, I sort of really mastered that. And that came through in that this was the first time in my life in anything that I ever actually ended up with the highest academic average in the class. So.
Dude, that's awesome. Good for you.
And
that's cool.
I will apologize to any of my students that were in there with me because I know I pissed them off because they said a couple of times I probably said, well, you guys are going to get a curve, but you're not now. So I'm responsible for that. So, but we started with like 27 in the class and graduated like 18. So
that's still pretty good.
Yeah, it's still a pretty good rate, but it was in Montgomery County at the time. Now it's like you have to get an associate's degree to get your paramedic. Yeah, it's now not just a certification. It's now pretty much most programs are at least an associate's level program. So
wow,
but
dang, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that came about. I want to say like in between 2008 2012 timeframe. So
gotcha.
So
yeah, wow. No kidding. Cool. Very cool. All right. Well, now I'm going to move us forward because right after all this, somewhere in here, you decide you want to be a pilot.
Yeah. So, so I come out
doing your thing in the engine room, now on deck to sailing and saving lives and EMT and paramedic. And you're like, screw it. Let me just go be a pilot now.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So what happens is I, then get, what happened. So I'm working in the marine safety side. I was doing like what was called compliance, which is international or port state control compliance. And one of the captains that was there was hand selecting officers to go with him to Marine Safety Office, Portland, Oregon. So myself and a couple of other officers in my office that had performed well were going out to MSO, Portland, Oregon. And so I got put into the investigation shop. So I did accident investigations for another 2 years. But that then put me in contact with and very close to Air Station Astoria, where actually not a classmate, but another student, another pilot who actually was a King's Pointer was actually out at Astoria. And so I had sort of reached out to him. And what you probably also need to know, I think it was my freshman year in high school. my high school professor had us write a 5-year letter to ourselves and a 10-year letter. And the 5-year letter said, when I wrote it, and you write a letter to yourself and then he mails it to you 5 years later, and then another one like 10 or 12, or I think your senior year, it was 10 years later, because I had the same professor. And so what ended up happening was that the first one said, if you're lucky when you're reading this, you'll be at a service academy. And then my senior one says, if you've managed to accomplish what you were hoping to do, you may be flying Coast Guard helicopters.
Oh man.
So
that's really cool.
So, what happened with me, somewhere along the lines in high school, I thought about going, I want to go Navy, I want to go Navy, I want to go Navy. And then I think it was around this time, Top Gun comes out. And I go and see Top Gun. And of course, everybody would be like, oh, I want to go fly F-14s. What did I see? I saw a Coast Guard rescue swimmer jumping out of an H-65 to pull goose out of the water. And I was like, that's me. That's me. That is what I want to do. And
real quick, it wasn't an H-65, it was an H-3. I help you out.
Right. You're right. Correct. It was an H-3. You're right. Oh, crap. I don't know.
I got correct.
You're right.
Because you know how many people would be like, that's not a 65.
Well, yeah, you're right. No, I got to get called out on that. It was an H-3. But I saw that and I was like, that's what I want to do. So anyway, so I'm doing marine casualty investigations out in Portland, Oregon. And about 18 months or 12 months in, or maybe not even that, I think 10 months in, I had mentioned to the captain, Captain Hall at that point. I had also changed my last name to Hall, not because of him. But I had mentioned him, I think I'd really like to go to flight school. And he pauses and looks at me and he goes, well, then why isn't there a letter on my desk? And he's like,
wow.
I'm like, okay. Because I was afraid that, like, when I said I want to apply to flight school, he was going to be, because he hand selected to pull me out here. He was like, I was fully expecting that he was going to say, I pulled you out here to work here and give you and he was a great CO. Like, he would come in and if it was because we're out in Portland, Oregon, and sometimes we get some really rainy, crappy days, he'd come in and look outside and go, this is a great sunny day. You could just all of a sudden walk around and go, sunshine, liberty, go, leave. It's like, I don't want to see you here.
Wow,
it's like,
that's
duty
awesome.
Section remains, it may remain available, but go enjoy yourself, go enjoy the good weather. So it was awesome. He was just an awesome CO. So I had mentioned, hey, I want to go to flight school. And he's like, well, why isn't there a letter on my desk? And I'm like, okay. And he's like, you got till Friday. And because there was the board was coming up, he gave me a glowing endorsement, just a glowing endorsement. And so, board meets, I don't get selected, and I was like, okay, so like, okay, you know what that means? You apply again. And
yes, sir.
So, and then I tried to figure out what else could I do? And a couple of other, I went out to Air Station Astoria, did a couple of flights with them, I also had a couple of my investigations involved me going out to go talk with them. And what I actually did on a couple of my investigations on actually it's a fishing vessel case. I had actually came up with some recommendations that we were going to increase the amount of retroreflective material on survival suits, and also make sure that crews, they just couldn't have a survival suit, but they need to have an appropriately sized survival suit. I had an interesting case with a fishing vessel with 3 people on board. They basically pitch poled coming out of Cape Disappointment, 3 bodies in the water. The captain, which was actually the dad and the husband to the other 2 people on board, was not able to get a survival suit on. So he was never recovered. The wife and the mom drowned in her survival suit because it was too small. And she was the last to be picked up. And she was lying on on her back, I think is when she was found. Then there was no retroreflective material on the front. The only retroreflective material was on the head, sort of going across the top of the head where you would figure that'd be sticking out of the water. Right. The son was recovered, and he had managed to get into his survival suit, had it completely zipped up, and he was the first recovered because his retro was picked up. And when I talked with the pilots and the flight mech, they said, the retro, as soon as, even with their NVGs or without the NVGs, like stood out. It was highly visible.
Oh, yeah.
And there was, when we looked at how much retro was on the survival suit, we realized there wasn't really that much there. So we made a recommendation out of that investigation to increase the amount of retro that was on there. And then also made recommendations that you have to have an appropriately fitting survival suit. It's not just a matter of having a survival suit on board. It was really sad in that, her survival suit, her head the opening was like up here and her head was well below that,
like literally like the head was above her head, like the headless horseman type thing. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Dang.
She was very short, and a little short, a little wide,
Got it.
And they'd also never practiced, their small family commercial fishing operation. None of them practiced putting on their survival suits. It was this, the safety aspect of it was an afterthought, so it was, so that's one of those things where it was kind of like, and then, you fast forward, I had a case when I was flying and, I remember looking down and seeing these survival suits for these 3 or 4 people that we were picking up. And the amount of retro that was, I looked and there's a lot of retro there. And I was like, I don't know if I had anything to do with it, but I was like, there's a lot more retro there than we probably had, so I was happy with that. So
that's great.
So apply a second time and lo and behold, there's my name on the list.
Yeah, buddy. Flight school, here we come. That's awesome.
Oh my God. I was dysfunctional for about 4 or 5 days after that. So, I was like, okay, now I gotta I gotta go through all when am I gonna go? Call in the detailer and, finally get my report date. I think I get down there like January of, I think I want to say 98. If I'm looking right, I have my mug down here somewhere.
On your arrival? I thought you got your mug when you graduated.
No, because it would give me an idea of I would have gotten there in January of 99 because I know when I went.
Yeah.
So January of 99. And
cool. Very cool.
Report for flight school and lots of interesting stories there. Still volunteered a little bit, but the fire department I volunteered with, man, they were scary. So I kind of decided not to run too many calls with them. Because it was like we were living in Milton, Florida, and they were a little redneck.
Got it.
Just a touch. So
right on.
I decided my self-preservation was more my interest. So
yeah. Well, and you were going on to bigger and better things as soon as you graduate flight school.
But there's, you go through these phases in your training and it's sort of like, and then there's this downtime, especially if you're between phases and may not be a lot to study or, so it's sort of, there's always something to study, but then there was other interesting things that happened. So I'm married. I am the day before I go for my NAMI whammy, the Naval Aviation Institute medical examination. Oh, okay. So your flight physical, your final flight physical. Okay. This is your final exam flight physical. And my wife calls me up and says, oh, I've got some news for you. I'm like, the bad news is that I got into a car accident and, the radiator is broken. I'm okay, but there's, oil in the coolant. And I'm thinking, that's not good. And so probably thinking, we're going to end up having to replace the engine. And then she says, oh, and by the way, I'm pregnant. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That's two really big things that you're telling me right off the get-go. All while I'm going through flight school.
Right.
Okay, let's do this.
Right before my flight physical. So needless to say, my blood pressure was up a tad. And so I had to go back the next day. He said, go run, go relax, come back. We'll recheck your blood pressure.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. I won't tell you when my wife says, oh, by the way, I'm pregnant. I inadvertently top 10 things not to say to your wife. Are you sure?
Oh.
Yeah. Because also realize, the other piece of this is I'm down in Pensacola. She's still back in Oregon.
Oh my gosh.
Because I decided that I was going to, for the first, to get through API so that I could be sort of focused on that and not too stressed. I decided I'd geo-batch it down there and then I'd look for a house to rent while we were down there, while I was down there. So yeah, so don't if your wife tells you you're pregnant, just say, "Oh, awesome! I'm so excited."
Yeah. Noted.
That's got to be your first reaction. I can't believe it. This is awesome.
This is amazing. I'm so excited.
Yeah. I just wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for it. That's my problem. If somebody had just prepped me and said, by the way, in about 2 minutes, your wife's going to call you and tell you she's pregnant. Damn it. Yeah.
Oh,
I failed the test. So, anyway, so coming out of flight school, trying to think if there was anything. There was one little thing that occurred in flight school that I think would be worthwhile just briefly touching on, and that is it foreshadowed what happened at the air station, with my time period at the air station, and that's my inadvertent relationship with birds. So I'm on my helicopter formation flight, and it wasn't my check ride, but I think it was the one flight before my check ride. And so for those who don't know, I don't know if you've had anybody talk about going through Navy flight school. You start off in fixed wing, you go from fixed wing to intermediates, and then you're doing some cross countries and you're learning instruments. And then for the rotary side, which is the bulk of probably Coast Guard aviation. There's one other little interesting thing. They wanted to send, when I came out of intermediates, I got a phone call from the Coast Guard liaison officer who says, we want to send you over to Corpus Christi to do fixed wing. And I was like, you want to do what? And he's like, yeah, we want to send you fixed wing. And I'm like, no. And he's looking at me like, he was a fixed wing guy. He's looking at me like, how could you possibly not want to go fixed wing? He's like, you get an opportunity to go with the majors. You'll make lots of money. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not the pointy end of the spear. I want to be on the pointy end. I want to be like on the helicopter. I want to be putting swimmers in the water. That's what I came here for. He's like, but he's like telling me like all these things. And I'm like, sir, if you do this, I may DOR. And there's dead silence on the other side of the phone. And he's like, you would drop on request? I'm like, yes, sir. And so he pauses. He goes, all right, pick your poison. You're going rotors. I couldn't have been happier, but you could hear the disappointment in his voice. So I'm in doing my rotary formation flight, and everything's going fine. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this huge, like, what probably was a goal. I think it was a golden eagle. I'm so focused I'm on left wing. So I'm -2, lead is over here. And this golden eagle, I think, comes out of nowhere, hits lead's main rotor draft, and basically then comes up behind it and then is sucked up right in towards our windscreen. And quite literally, I briefly remember this flash going across my screen, the chin bubble, and then we're flying the Bell 206, and it just sails right past off to my right. I think it probably then got caught in our downdraft from our main rotor, and then probably did the same thing. The flight instructor I'm with freaks out. He's screaming like, oh my God. He's like, but I have the control. No, you have the controls. He lost it. He thought we were going to die. He thought that, and it had to have been big enough. I mean, I was so focused on flying that I really didn't notice how big it was, but it was big enough that he called to knock it off. We landed because he had passed the controls back to me, and gets out of the helicopter, goes over around the corner, I think pukes, then gets back into the helicopter. Just, I think a huge adrenaline dump. And he's like, all right, you got to pass. We're done. We're going back. We're not flying forms. Whatever happened was significant enough that it freaked the living hell out of him. It wasn't anything that I did. But I was so focused on, the flight and flying on -1 that I really never really saw that. I was seeing through the bird or whatever came flying up, and which portrays to what happens later on in my, as I'm starting to fly with the fleet. So anyways, I am now, so I graduate, I wing, I winged on July 14th, 2000. And I become Naval Aviator 25,733. And I believe I'm Coast Guard Aviator 4,451 or so.
Nice.
I'd have to go double check the register. Somewhere in that range. And what I will do is I want to pause here for a brief moment because I want to remember there's a gentleman who winged. He actually officially, in terms of coming out of Pensacola, winged after me, and that's Lieutenant Commander Dale Taylor. He's no longer with us. So we lost Dale in a training flight down in Mobile, and he left behind a wife and 2 daughters. His wife wrote a great book about him. He was not in the same class as me, but we were progressing at right about the same time. I mean, I passed him all the time in the halls, going from one flight to the next flight or something like that. What was awesome about Dale was he was always there with a fist bump or something to sort of encourage you and be like, you got this. If you had a bad flight, bad run, he was just awesome. He was a great guy. I didn't know him. Something like, he, I think, was married at that point. So when you go to flight school as a coastie, you've already been out, as you already have heard, you've already been out to the fleet. You've either been afloat once, first, second tour. In my case, I was a second tour student going in. And so flight school was technically my third tour. So we have more experience, and we also have families in life that's generally outside of that. But anyways, Dale was awesome. And we lost Dale after I had already left the Coast Guard, but I had heard about it. Actually working in the emergency room from another pilot, we were flying a patient out, and he had mentioned to me, he flies for Dartmouth Hitchcock. And he had mentioned to me that we had had a crash down in Mobile and lost Dale. So, anyways,
terrible tragedy, that accident.
But I think it's always a downer to sort of bring these things up, but it's important to remember, because as long as we remember them, then, they live on.
Right.
And I think that's important.
For sure.
And it also speaks to the nature of what Coast Guard aviation is, and naval aviation for that matter. But, it's risky just training. We do everything we can to mitigate that risk, and we have policies and procedures, but the risk doesn't go away.
Right.
And, accidents happen. And that's the unfortunate thing. So
we're going to divert real quick to thank our sponsors.
Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, save lives, and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
So I come out of, I wing. I've actually got my son there. That was one other little thing. So I passed my safe for solo check ride on a Friday, and my wife's water broke the following Sunday. So have my son on Monday. I was supposed to solo Monday, and so I didn't solo for 2 weeks.
You had a son. That's all right.
It was
worth it.
That was worth it. The other challenge then became, because my son was born on August 30th. So what happened was we're now in hurricane thunderstorm season. So weathered out, warm up. So 8 weeks later, I finally solo. So it was this longest period of time to go from safe for solo check ride to actually soloing. It was nuts, but finally soloed, graduate, wing. I get orders. I'm going to Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was a little disappointed. I wanted to go to Cape Cod. I wanted 60s, and I wanted to fly the big iron, and I wanted to go to Cape Cod. But,
well, put you close to home too. I mean, back to New England. I get it. I totally get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I got New Jersey, and I got Tupper Wolf. So
you're flying. You're flying. Yeah. That's all that really matters.
And you know what? Here's what I'll say about the A65. So I flew Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie model.
Oh wow!
And so and we were at prime. We're at the prime unit. So because I came in just as we were, getting ready, I think, for the first upgrade to Bravo, and then shortly after Bravo, with a mishap that occurred in the Med, which I can actually even talk briefly about. So we had a single engine. So as you know, we had governor issues with the LTS 101s.
Yep.
So we had a crew that was deployed, I want to say for Gulf War II, and they were in the Med on a 270. And
Mediterranean, by the
yes,
way.
Mediterranean. Yes. So
I know
Coast
the
Guard
Med,
overseas. And so they were over there, had a governor failure, and their options were either to do a single engine landing to the boat at night, ditch in the water, or land on the beaches of Syria. So
Jeez.
they stuck the landing, and both the pilot and co-pilot got air medals. And they then went and testified before Congress. And shortly thereafter, there was some money to actually re-engine the helicopters with the Ariel 2C2s as opposed to the LTS 101s.
Nice.
And the differences there were night and day. But what I can say is, having flown the Alpha model, as a Alpha model helicopter pilot, you became very good at power management.
Yeah.
And, this is one thing that you had.
You had no choice. Yeah.
Right.
And the way that I was in that sucker, and it overtorqued at least, I remember specifically 3 flights of an overtorque. Oh, engine overtorque.
Yeah. Yep. And
they were awful.
What was funny, so it was interesting, which actually, as you mentioned overtorque, so because I overtorqued on my first actual SAR case with a hoist. So
kind of not surprising, but yeah, I get it.
But it was I actually have the hoist cam footage from this, and I'll get that to you.
Oh, perfect.
And rescue checklist part 2 complete, readiness for harness delivery of the swimmer. Roger. Okay. All right, the swimmer has something to say. Back up ICS real quick. Sure. Yeah, Mr. Hall, we got about 15-foot trees here, so okay. If we don't keep it steady, I'm gonna get pretty all right, that's fine. Just want to let you know that, sir. Okay, just give me a target that you want to shoot for. You just keep your reference on whatever you need to, sir, and just let you know that. That's how it's gonna. Okay. I think right below us here, James. Right there? That looks like a good spot. Right there. You want to hold on? No, okay. Alright. Alright. And rescue checklist part 2 complete, readiness for harness delivery of the swimmer. Okay. Alright, I can go on hot mic and check the swimmer. On hot mic, checking swimmer. That's power. And swimmer is ready, booming swimmer out. Okay. Alright, sir. Keep your whole position, swimmer's going down. About right 10. Reset my rad off. Easy right. Easy right. Hold position. Swimmer's about halfway down. Swimmer's going down. Swimmer's giving the hold signal. Going down. Swimmer's about 10 feet off the deck. Swimmer's going down. Swimmer's down. Swimmer's on the ground. Swimmer's disconnecting. Hook's coming back up. Swimmer is okay. Hook's halfway up. Okay. Pull back left, throttle back. Roger, coming back. Self-descend. Roger that. You are clear back. For lighter, you're at 90%. You have plenty of power. Hook's coming up. Hook's just below the aircraft. Hook's coming up. Hook's outside. Cabin door going off high line. Roger. We might have to dump some fuel. We're only at 90%. Hovering there. Okay. What's our reserve right now? 12-13%. Okay.
So I think I'm a first pilot at this point, and no, I'm not even that. But this is my first operational hoist, is what I should say. Okay, so I'm first pilot, and I'm on duty, and all of a sudden, SAR alarm goes off. An F-16 that was in the pattern or doing some work, pattern work or bombing work up in the range above Atlantic City, New Jersey. He loosened up his straps, and as he was pushing over to form up onto lead, he floated up out of the seat and then couldn't reach the controls because he was doing a negative G pushover. So he punches out and he ends up going down into the woods. So we end up getting launched out to go hoist him out of the Pine Barrens. So that was my first operational hoist, which was somewhere, and we get in there, and I've actually got this. So with the hoist cam footage, what you'll hear is the swimmer, like we're going through rescue check part 2, and we're talking about, okay, we're going to do a mad poo pickup. We've identified where the pilot is because he's got his, his EPIRB going off. And we're about 125 feet, maybe 150 feet for the hoist because of all the trees. And in this great moment of crew resource management, I think the rescue swimmer really probably wanted to say, hey, Mr. Hall, I know you're like the new guy. Don't go dragging me through the trees because you're gonna wreck my day. But he comes up and he basically says, hey, Mr. Hall, I recognize like we're up in the wood, up in the trees here. It's really important that you maintain a steady hover here. Do whatever you need to do. And I'm like, okay, Roger that. And I recognize what he said. And I said, is there any references that you want, anything that you need? So it was this great moment of what I would, say CRM, where the swimmer felt comfortable enough to come up and say, hey, I have a concern. Nice. And, right before, because we had already called for rescue check part 2, and then he comes up on ICS and, plugs in and says, hey, I just Mr. Hall, I just want you to know, like, it's sort of like, let's interject with, I just want you to know we're all counting on you. It's like the line from Airplane. And it's, but basically to say, hey, if you drag me through the trees, we're going to have a bad day. But in the process, we ended up putting the swimmer down. We got the pilot and it came back up. You can actually see his helmet where it's sort of peeled back a little bit. And he's got a little wind burn on his forehead from when he ejected.
Wow.
So, and it's a great hoist cam footage. And that was the only thing. And it was immediately, what I think also got a lot of media attention out of it was that it was right after 9/11.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So, because there was that whole debacle. But so anyway, he we get him up into the cabin and we're flying out and but it was great hoist cam footage and so I'll get that to you. But that was my first operational hoist and I over torqued but when I came back the maintenance chief was yelling at me. He goes, if you're going to over torque a helicopter on a rescue mission, you damn well better over torque it and not over torque it by 104%, with the limit being like 103.7%. He's like, bend that airframe. He's like, yeah. Bend the airframe.
Yeah.
He's like, make it look good. And it was because I had, what was great was I had, our aircraft commander who was in my left seat you can hear him calling out power calls, it's like, okay, we're got a little bit, but we were pulling 100% in that hover. Yeah. Damn. And it wasn't hot. It wasn't humid. There was no safety margin. And, in particular, like what a lot of people probably don't know with the 65, especially at this time, if we went out with a 10% power margin, that's nothing, especially if you crap an engine and you're over the boat, you're swimming.
Yeah. Yeah. There was no recovering out of that aircraft. If you lost an engine, you're in the water or you're on the ground. You're turned into a lawn dart. You might as well be flying on one engine. If you pull, what you would do at this point, you would pull to 91.5% on the NR. So pull until you're drooping, and then you're going to level the nose, level the wings, and that's an accelerating attitude. If you're lucky, you might get through translational lift. If not, you're at least going to be in a level attitude when you're putting it down on the water. Which is the goal.
And and then you're going to want to either shear or pull the swimmer in, depending upon where they are.
Right. And But I remember having those discussions as going out as a swimmer. Like, okay, hey, we're pulling 90% right now. So here's the plan. We're gonna spit you out and then shear it as you're moving forward to land in the water. I mean, that was the brief.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Roger that.
Yeah, and then get under the water before all the debris comes flying towards you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because depending upon, and it was interesting. So depending upon which way the helicopter rolls, is going to determine whether that main gearbox rips out going forward and through the cabin and through the cockpit, or rips out backwards.
Right.
Because as it's rotating, if you're rotating looking up from underneath and it's going counterclockwise, which if I'm remembering right, that's where Tupperware rotates. Yeah. If you roll right, that main gearbox is going to shear out behind you because of the moment arm created by the that by the rotor hitting on the right side, and it's going to shear out behind you, and you'll hopefully have a better chance of surviving. If you roll to the left, it's going to roll out forward, and it's going to tear through the cabin.
Yep.
So, and you're having a bad day.
Absolutely. And what you're really hoping for is that the blades blow apart before the rotor, the whole system, the whole gearbox comes off. That's what you're hoping.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh.
But,
I love that. I love to fly.
Right. What I would also jump to is I got a great case. I think this was really my first legitimate search and rescue case. So my first search and rescue case actually was nothing more than like a flare sighting that we went out and flew on. So, it was like an out and back for a track line search or something along that line. So it was very anticlimactic, but that did come at me within 3 days of getting to the air station. Like, I'm a brand new co-pilot, first day of duty, hour into it, you're launched, So It was kind of like, okay, I'm game for this. And, but then my first real SAR case came in, it was spring of 90, spring of shortly after I got there. So I got there around August, we get through winter. I kind of felt like I had this dry spell where I don't think I had a whole lot of cases, a lot of getting launched out for different search patterns and things like that, but nothing where we actually did anything. So we get a medevac mission for on a fishing vessel with a guy who's having severe back pain, rating it 7 or 8 out of 10 back pain. So, okay, we're launching out for, a back pain patient. But he also was reported to us to look like he was in shock, which was a little concerning. So a little pale, a little sweaty. I mean, and they had a rapid heart rate. They're not able to measure a blood pressure, So, so we're launching out and we're sitting at the departure end of runway 32, I think it was, at Atlantic City. And it's 00. We're all I can see is the numbers runway 3 and 2. So, I call up tower and we filed IFR, we filed to a point offshore. And I'm like, okay, tower, this is, rescue 6534. We're, at the numbers runway 32, IFR to, the northeast. And I think I'd filed for 2,000 feet or so. Tower comes back with 6534, rescue 6534. Are you sure you want to do this? Yeah. And I look at my, I'm the new guy. I'm looking at my Lieutenant Commander Cottrell, who's right next to me, and she just nods her head. We're like, okay, so we take off. We're 00. So that means we had to have an alternate, and it was all supposed to burn off. It was that standard marine layer fog and shit that you get, in the spring, where you get warm, moist air over a cold body of water. So we take off and we're now doing, I program in a rendezvous. I'm the safety pilot for this mission. And we tried doing an ISVS letdown. We sort of think we paint them on the radar. We're trying to do a surface search on them. And basically with the rendezvous, we're putting in their lat long position, the direction they're going, and their speed. And then the computer knows where we are and then programs an intercept so that we can intercept with them. And then basically kind of try to do a letdown to about 150 feet and doing what we call an IAS-VS letdown. So it's just sort of descending down to about 150 feet and see if we can make contact. We don't even make contact with the water. So next one, we come back around and now I'm setting up and I'm going to be flying. We're going to try and do a catch. And we do a catch, and George is being
automated.
It's a computer-aided approach to a coupled hover.
Oh, that's right, catch. Okay,
catch and a match. Manual-aided approach to a coupled hover, since being replaced with a precision-aided approach to a coupled hover, which is a patch. So catch, match, and patch, which are now somewhat used interchangeably, but the match hasn't changed as far as I know of. Again, I may be a little dated. So now we do a catch. George is squirrely, does not really work out. So next approach is a match. And so I'm flying the match down. So manually going through all the gates to come down somewhere hopefully behind the boat. And we get down to about 50 feet. And the PIC or my aircraft commander can actually make contact with the water. So she's sort of giving me conning commands and sort of looking at the radar to the point where now just probably about 250 feet in front of us, she can start to make out the boat. She takes the controls. I take a breath because I'm like the whole time I'm just totally scanning my instruments, because I'm flying 50 feet over the water at about 30 knots and just trying to sort of keep in one direction. You can't see a thing.
Yeah.
And
Dude, that's a scary
the way
spot
that we
to be in.
Right.
Even
the
as
way
an
that
air
we fly
member,
this,
I'm like, oh boy.
Yeah. The way that we fly this is that, you have one person who's totally on the instruments and one person who's the safety pilot on the other side.
Yeah.
And, they'll be looking outside, inside, but they're, so that's kind of how we're doing that. So we make contact with the boat, put our swimmer down, and unfortunately, I cannot remember who the swimmer was. It's 20 years ago. I can look it up in my logbook, but anyways, so put him down, and the swimmer knew that I was a medic. Because occasionally I would go down and talk with the swimmers, and I actually helped occasionally with EMT training and helped with a couple of swimmers get through EMT school when they were struggling. So we get him down. He calls back. They're now trying to figure out what we're going to do with the patient, and you're going to hear me normally in the Coast Guard. I think we would refer to him as the victim, but I'm a clinical mind still.
Patient.
So it's patient. And he calls me up and he goes, "Hey, can I ask Mr. Hall a question?" And so totally now we're like in non-standard territory, but he calls me up and he says, "Hey, Mr. Hall, I'm kind of concerned. This guy's complaining of really bad back pain. He describes it like it's tearing, and he looks like crap, or he looks really bad." And I'm like, okay, I make the suggestion, check blood pressure on the right arm, check a blood pressure on the left arm. And the right arm pressure was about 20 or 30 points. The systolic pressure was 20 or 30 points lower than the left. And so what I pointed out, I was like, we've now gone all the way up here, and I'm going, shit, this is probably not good, because he's shocky. He's describing this tearing sensation in his back. And so, my concern is an aortic dissection.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so I made, and at that same point, we're making our way towards Fire Island. And so the 47 motor lifeboat is coming out from Fire Island to rendezvous, and they're actually literally now pulling up on scene. And my concern that I just sort of brought up, and I said, okay, here's my concern. He could have a very, like a tear that could rupture in his aorta that would kill him instantly. And my concern was, if we hoisted him, that the stress of the hoist, depending upon, without him being medicated or anything like that, could be enough to rupture the aorta. And, so I expressed this to Commander Cottrell, and I said, the motor lifeboat's here. We could just put him in the litter, transfer him to the motor lifeboat, transfer him over to the ambulance, and it would be a much smoother, maybe less stressful transfer. And so we've gone all the way up here, 0-0 in the goo, put our swimmer down, and now we make the decision we're not going to hoist. And she listened to me. She was like, okay, it makes sense, because I explained to her. And so we do the transfer with this. It plays out this way: transfer the patient over to an ambulance. We land at Fire Island, wait for the weather to improve, and then fly back. I managed to find out which hospital he was going to, and I called and actually managed to call into the ER and talked with the ER attending, who had talked with the surgeon after the patient had gone to the OR, and he had a 17-centimeter aortic dissection.
No. Oh my gosh. Well done.
So it was, I don't know if it was dumb luck but it was just, and this, I had said, they expressed they suggested that there's a possibility that if we had hoisted, it may have been enough to kill him if he were stressed. So
Bro,
that was.
I love the fact that you're up in the front of the aircraft flying it, and then the swimmer goes down and be like, "Hey, I got a question for you. Your medical knowledge is a little bit better than mine. This is what I got." Yeah. And now you've got to literally put the medical hat on. Okay, let me think about all this. Okay, yeah, this is what I think. And then you're flying and treating medical at the same time, helping a brother out down below. Oh yeah.
And there's a lot of people who would be very cringe on that. They'd be like, because there's in a way, between the front of the cockpit and the operational side, the medical side of things, there's a brick wall that sometimes exists there.
True. Very true.
And they don't want front seat people making medical decisions. And I get that. But at the same token, there's a flip side to this in that there's another case that I had where we went and we did a medevac mission for a young kid with a head injury who, and it was basically nobody else was flying. So who do they call? They call the Coast Guard, and Coast Guard goes out. We go out and we go pick up this young kid who had fallen and had a head bleed. And we got a physician assistant that's going to go on the flight with us in the back. And in our direction from the flight surgeon was, you need to fly at the lowest possible altitude. But it's gooey. We're like scud running at 500 feet at night. And I'm saying to myself, and I'm trying to communicate that flying at 500 feet versus 2,500 feet does not make a difference for the patient in terms of barometric pressure change on their head bleed, but it makes a huge difference in terms of obstacle avoidance and hitting something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I really think we need to fly at a higher altitude. And the pilot I was flying with was like, no, we've been told we need to fly at the lowest possible altitude. Well, we went inadvertent IMC. So now we're committed to, and we have like 2.5 minutes of pucker factor while we're trying to get up to altitude, hoping we don't run into a tower. And we're flying over the Delmarva Peninsula. And so it was like one of these moments where I'm going, and I know in the back of my head, like if we were going up to like 10 or 12,000 feet short, that's going to make a big difference.
No shit. But, even like 7,000 feet. Yeah. There's a difference there too. 2,500. I'm with you. I don't, that's not,
to go from 500 to 2,500 feet.
No.
You're not looking at that big of a difference in barometric pressure that you're going to have that it's going to have neurologically compromised the kit. And
I'd rather avoid obstacles. That's me personally.
Yeah, because when we look at medevac helicopter incidents, what's killing those people? And it's running into things. It's CFIT. It's running into running into obstacles.
Yeah.
And this is where my brain gets tormented in a way, because I can see things from the medical side and I can see things from the aviation side.
Yeah.
And, it's like there was a whole nother case where there's another good one, so we get a medevac mission for a guy that goes over the side. And he basically was under the water for probably 20 to 25 minutes. He's pulled aboard. It's at night. We're probably 90 miles offshore. The weather is not great. The person that went overboard, I believe, was the captain. And what happened was, they're doing CPR. I think they did CPR for about 15 or 20 minutes, stopped, called us, and then did CPR, then found out that we were coming, and then resumed CPR. So there was a break in CPR there, probably about 15 minutes or so. I don't know. But we do know there was a break in CPR. So we're going out 2 ships because we have 2 B-0 helicopters at Atlantic City. Plan was going to be to put the rescue swimmer down, get the victim or the patient into the litter, and then they would be still doing CPR and then hoist. And then we would, this Dash 2, which was going to be my aircraft, I'm the safety pilot for the mission, and we're going to be hoisting the person off. And then, so this way we minimize our interruption in CPR. Because as you know, if we're going to do a hoist, single provider, that interruption in CPR is going to be huge, and it's going to have really detrimental outcome for the patient. And in my perspective, when I look at it, I go, the risks of doing the hoist potentially outweigh the benefit for the patient. And again, that's just where my brain is and how I'm looking at this.
Yeah.
So these things don't go according to plan. Swimmer gets down on deck, and in the process, so again, we think it was the captain that went over the side. Crewman's piloting the boat who doesn't have the experience and is not maintaining a steady course when we're going to put the swimmer down. The cable gets wrapped around the rigging, and the swimmer, in the process of going down and then coming back up and the helicopter falling out of position, gets dragged through the rigging. And the swimmer does. And he's severely injured. So he gets pulled back up into to the cabin. They take one look at him, and they're now heading to Atlantic City trauma.
Was that Dave Beecham?
So, yeah.
Oh my
Yeah, it
God,
was.
I know that story. Holy shit, I know that story. And
Yeah.
I'm okay. I've heard that story
So-
directly from him. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I remember going to see Dave the next day, and I'm just like, I am so sorry. You know, I felt so bad for him. I got to watch all of that play. So I'm in dash 2, I'm behind him, and I watched all of this play out on NVGs in front of me.
Oh my God.
And you're hopeless to do anything, you know. So
Wow.
but it was at that moment. So that actually was sort of a little bit of a pivotal moment for me, because I kept trying to sort of suggest that the risks of doing this hoist at night, you know, we're not going to have a good outcome, and the risks are sitting over here, the gains are sitting, you know, down here.
Yeah.
You know, and was sort of struggling with rationalizing this, and I knew, you know, I was also where I was looking at, you know, longevity in my career. As pilots, we, you know, yes, we have, you know, but pilot's not our only job, and you usually progress on to either doing safety, engineering, you know, some other element. And at that point, I was starting to think, you know, what would be kind of cool to do would be to become a physician assistant and then become a flight surgeon for the Coast Guard, but be a flying flight surgeon. You know,
Wow,
a line qualified aviator to be a flight surgeon. And which
I don't even know if that even exists. You'd be like the first.
I would have been the first. And it didn't exist at the time. But what I will, and there's a bunch of other stuff to sort of talk about between here and there. But at some point, I did go down to headquarters and talked, because I started reading about the physician assistant program, and, you know, talked with the HS that we had, or the PA that we had, that was our flight surgeon. And basically I had sort of learned about, you know, one of the things I had heard that was going wrong with the PA program was that a lot of our PAs were failing out of the program because they were HSs, and it's a master's level program. It's a difficult program, and you're learning, it's like learning through a fire hose. You know, you're drinking water through a fire hose in PA school. And, you know, so, and then not all of the PAs that were coming out of that program were either flight qualified or wanted to go in to be a flight surgeon.
Yeah.
So at that point, I was flight qualified. I wanted to be a flight surgeon. As a paramedic, I had more than an ample clinical experience to go and do this. So I happened to call up somebody that I'd met before, or talked with before, Captain French, who happened to be at Coast Guard headquarters just down the hall from the Admiral of Health and Safety, and had sent him an email and said, "Hey, I'm interested in doing this." And he just sends me this email back. He says, "That's brilliant. When can you come down?" So, you know, I get my my tropicals in working order, and I come down and I meet with Captain French, and then I go in.
That's a bit of our, not quite our dress uniform, but our nice uniform.
But it's the nice uniform.
Your button-up shirt.
Right. And so I talked it over with him, wasn't quite anticipating it, and then he brings me down the hall to meet with the Admiral of Health and Safety.
Oh, wow.
And then I went and met with the PA who runs the physician assistant program. And so, and we sort of, and this got batted around for about 3 or 4 weeks. You know, what about sending an officer to this? And the answer that came back was, well, this is a commissioning program for enlisted members. So if we now send an officer who's already a commissioned officer into the program, we're taking away a slot for an enlisted member to advance into the commissioned ranks. And that was the rationale that was used to say no, which I understood. And I was like, okay, you know, because I knew I was going off the beaten path, you know. In a lot of respects, my command actually supported it. You know, it was in my OER. They were like, this probably would be a good fit for him. So anyway, so that's where that Captain French ties into here. And
wow, that's pretty cool.
But here's the crazy part. So fast forward a little bit, and again, there's a bunch of other SAR cases I can talk about, but fast forward a little bit, there's 2 years later after I'm out, and I'm already going down this path now of becoming a nurse, and then a bunch of other stuff that I'm doing at that point. And I find out they opened up the program for PAs to officers.
Oh,
Yeah.
the timing. Hey, you know what?
Well,
you actually might have started something though. That could
and
be.
what I sort of heard through the grapevine was, I was the one that stepped forward with the idea, and that's where it came. That's most likely where it came from.
Wow.
So
nobody
will remember the fact that it was me that had asked for that.
They will now.
But yeah, and it was kind of my goal at that point, and this is where I kind of feel like, I failed in my Coast Guard career. My goal at that point, and it's always been about goals for me. I've always, if I have a goal in mind or something in mind that I want to achieve, and it was either going to be NP or PA, and that was kind of where my brain was going. And I thought about maybe doing NP after doing 20 years, and maybe I should have done that. But I still think everything played out the way that it should. I have no misgivings, and especially everything that I've done since then. And what frustrated me at times about, doing the search and rescue thing on the Coast Guard side in terms of flying was I don't feel like I was impacting enough lives. And I think that's always kind of what had driven me. It was like, I want to make a bigger difference than what I'm doing. The 70 some odd people that I helped, during my Coast Guard career, I wanted more than that,
Yeah, right on.
And
hey, I want to back up to that story that you were talking about.
We need to back up to a bunch of other things.
Yeah, that's all right. That's okay. That's okay. The outcome, because you had mentioned like hoist versus not hoist. So Dave had gone down to the ship, and again, I know that story pretty well because him and I talked about it. Again, swimmer top in the shop. But did you end up hoisting down to that ship after? Okay.
Yeah.
So and then brought the patient up.
We put our swimmer down and recovered the patient, and then medevaced him, and then I think within 5 minutes of arrival at the hospital they had called the code.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Which I figured as much. I think I remember Dave saying that too. And if I remember correctly, they brought Dave to the hospital, and then you guys landed at that same hospital directly after, right?
Yeah. Well, we went. Yeah. No, actually, he went to Atlantic City Medical Center.
Okay.
Where he landed, and the rescue swimmer is now the patient.
Yeah.
We went to I want to say a hospital in Delaware.
Okay.
If I recall correctly, because it was that was the closest hospital from where we were at that point in time, but that hospital was not a trauma center.
Got it. Okay.
And Dave needed a trauma center.
Yeah, and this story was told to me well over 10 years ago. So I remember it because there's a lot of details in the story, which I don't want to disclose because I was not on scene and I don't want to tell somebody else's story. So, but it was, I remember sitting there like, holy cow, like just wow, kind of in awe.
The fact that the injuries which Dave sustained were substantial. And,
yeah.
And it's not anybody's one particular individual's fault, but it's the nature of the operation, and these things happen. One of the things that I think contributed to it was having an inexperienced helmsman at the wheel, because what he kept doing, from what I could see, and it looked like the bow of the ship kept turning to port a little bit. So my guess it would do sort of cyclically. And what I think the helmsman was doing was he kept looking over his left shoulder at the helicopter coming in to put Dave down.
Got it. Yeah.
And what I think ended up happening was that inadvertently led to them going lost target. And that's all it takes. It's
combination of a couple things just going south.
Yeah.
Dang. Right on. Again, I was not on board it, so I'll wait for Dave to come on to tell that story.
Yeah.
We're going to divert real quick to thank our sponsors.
Centum, the creator of LifeSeeker. When every second counts in search and rescue, LifeSeeker turns mobile phones into beacons, guiding teams with precision, even in remote areas. With a proven track record and hundreds of successful missions, it boosts success rates and saves lives. Learn more at Centum.com.
All right, so there's a couple things that I want to actually, I don't know if I want to back up to or just, but it definitely needs to be made mention here is that you earned yourself a couple things while you were in Atlantic City. And the first one, I'm going to read this. This is a letter of accommodation. It says this: I note with pride and and am pleased to commend you for your performance of duty while serving as co-pilot aboard Coast Guard helicopter 6514 on the morning of 2 December 2000. The crew of the helicopter was awoken at 2 a.m. and notified that a fisherman with 4 severed fingers on the fishing vessel Mr. Marco, located 100 miles east of Atlantic City, New Jersey, needed a medical evacuation. Due to this long distance, you knew the helicopter would need maximum fuel. You directed the night crew to ready the fuel truck and quickly computed the amount needed. Once airborne, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Winds grew to 30 knots. Seas increased to 10 feet. Visibility fell to 5 miles. And overcast skies created very dark and challenging conditions. While en route, you handled a flurry of communications with Mr. Marco, your cover aircraft, and approach controllers, gathered information on the patient's status, briefed the fishing vessel's crew on the pending hoist, and orchestrated a clear recovery plan. On scene, the crew found the vessel pitching violently and realized the 15-foot davit and 20-foot light structure on the port quarter would prevent a standard hoist from the vessel's port side. Compounding the risk with 2 60-foot whip antennas on either side of the wheelhouse and no bulkboard on the transom to keep personnel from falling overboard if they slipped on the wet and rolling deck. As a safety pilot, for your visual approach, you provided timely advisories on the position, speed, altitude, and engine parameters. Due to the many snag hazards, the helicopter approached the vessel from the starboard quarter and executed the hoist as far forward as possible. However, this left the aircraft commander with no visual references. Maximizing all of your resources, you continued vigilant execution of your safety pilot duties and delivered a steady stream of advisories. Despite having less light and references than the pilot at the controls, at one point you detected the helicopter backing, provided accurate and concise advisories, and therefore prevented a potential mishap. Although this was your first actual rescue, you carried out your safety pilot duties commensurate with the ability of a seasoned professional, and your actions directly resulted in one life being assisted. You're commended for your outstanding performance of duty. By your meritorious service, you have upheld the highest traditions of the United States Coast Guard. Holy shit. Like, I know we talked about a whole bunch, but that just saying your first actual rescue? What?
Yeah, that was actually my first rescue.
And then you go into the trees.
Right. And then you could, but here's another way that you could potentially summarize that, and that is, that is the first time that I nearly punched the float switch.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
when we say that we were backing down, there was one moment when we were looking up into the rigging of the boat. We were down in a trough, and that backing down scenario was actually more like 15 to 18 degrees right wing down. We had a radar altimeter reading of somewhere between 10 to 15 feet.
Holy cow.
And we were nose up, probably about 10 or 12 degrees. So we're sort of sitting, doing my fighter pilot stuff here. I'm trying to do this so the camera picks it up. But you're like, you're sort of tilted over and up, and looking out the left side, all I can see is black. And then I'm looking off to my right, and all I can see is water. And we're 100 miles offshore. And I was like I put my hand behind the cyclic just so that we didn't go back any further, and talked to the pilot I was flying with, who was great. It was one of these moments where the boat was moving, we were moving, and, SA, we kind of lost a little bit of SA, and it was just
situational awareness,
Gotcha. And it was, wasn't that we got necessarily spatially disoriented, but the boat's moving and we're moving, and there's little references over the water. And I like my finger on the bottom of the collective, there's a button there that you can hit to deploy the floats. Yeah. And my finger was sitting right, just hovering over that. And I and I didn't want to be like the guy out on his first SAR case to punch the floats, but I was that close.
Wow.
So,
What was the outcome? You guys ended up hoisting them off and everything worked
we
out?
got them off without any problem. It was so funny because after we come out of this little whifferdale behind the boat, and now we're popped back up, sitting over on the starboard side, getting ready to come back in to do the hoist.
Yeah.
So basically, in a way, the poor pilot is taking some conning commands from me, and he's taking some conning commands from the flight mech, because we're coming in on the starboard quarter. So it was totally non-standard.
Yeah.
And
a lot of information coming at somebody too.
Yeah. It was a lot to take in. And but it was a good case, in a way. I don't say it was a good one for your first one, but it's like it gave me some degree of confidence that, okay, if I can do this, if I can not shit my pants on this one, then maybe I'll be okay. So
totally.
There was just a bit of an eye opener. And granted, I am like, I was only at Atlantic City for like 6 years, and I'm not like a multi-tour, didn't go to Alaska, didn't do any of the, the crazy stuff. I ended up moving on to some other things after that. But it was a good case, and it was one of those moments where I was like, all right, this shit's real, So
man, wow. So that was in 2000. I know you have a bunch out of Atlantic City, like a bunch of not only missions, but you've earned yourself quite a few awards. I'm going to read another one if that's okay. I'd like to go into this one. So you earned yourself an achievement medal. And here's what this one says. Citation to accompany the award of the Coast Guard Achievement Medal to Lieutenant John B. Hall, United States Coast Guard. Lieutenant Hall is cited for superior performance of duty while serving as H-65B co-pilot of 6527 on the night of July 1, 2002. On that evening, Lieutenant Hall demonstrated superior aviation skills and leadership during a rescue of 3 people stranded on the Delaware River when an amphibious vehicle was overpowered by the current and lodged mid-river in the rapids. After local rescue crews and other rescue assets assessed the situation, it was determined that the rescue exceeded their capabilities, and they turned to call the Coast Guard. Using diligent and well-thought-out risk management and flight planning, the helicopter crew accepted the high-risk mission. From the start, the helicopter crew faced a myriad of challenges, such as a very dark night, several obstacles such as bridges, towers, and power lines, poor communications with rescuers not experienced in helicopter rescue operations, and 500-foot walls rising up on either side of the riverbed. Once on scene, the helicopter discovered the amphibious vehicle was in fact a mid-sized car. This left the crew to content with a much smaller platform to hoist from than expected. Forced to make an approach through the narrow river gorge, Lieutenant Hall provided crucial conning commands to the pilot to avoid rising terrain and assisted with establish the aircraft into a stable hover despite poor visibilities and deteriorating river vortices that created optical illusions. On scene, Lieutenant Hall made several essential recommendations to recover the survivors. During the rescue, Lieutenant Hall aided with maintaining the aircraft's position relative to the car. His actions were key in the 25 minutes of hovering in the extreme challenging conditions. Once the survivors were safe, Lieutenant Hall safely flew the helicopter out of the gorge to a nearby airport. Lieutenant Hall's actions, skills, and expertise resulted in the saving of 3 lives. Lieutenant Hall's diligence, perseverance, and devotion to duty are most heartily commended in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Coast Guard. Woo! That is one hell of a write-up, man.
Yeah,
that's good.
So that was an interesting case. That's one actually that also stands out. So I'll send you some information on it. But there's this thing called an amphicar,
an
amphicar is an amphicar. It is an amphibious. It's an amphibious car that can actually drive into the water. It'll make somewhere between 5 to maybe 7 knots of speed, and then can drive itself back out. There is like a few of these made. And so there was this guy in Philadelphia who would drive around, and it's a convertible too. So he would drive around and offer to pick up people for a convertible, in a convertible, and then take them for a ride, not tell them that it was an amphicar, and then drive into a body of water and then, drive them around and then drive them back out and drop them back off wherever they wanted to. This was his shtick.
Nice.
So Mr. Wizard here decides, you know what? I'm going to, we're going to go do this, and I'm going to go drive into the Schuylkill River. Well, as you saw, I think it was, June or July? So the water flow through the Schuylkill was actually pretty high at this point because we had had several storms that had come through. And it turns out that, the Schuylkill River was running somewhere between 8 to maybe 9 knots versus his car, which could do 5 to 7 knots. So you can do the math. It sort of leaves you in a little bit of a deficit.
Yeah, right.
And so Mr. Wizard picked up these 2 young ladies who were in their late teens, 20s, and drives into the river with these 2 girls and gets himself stuck mid-river. And so they're trying to figure out how they're going to get to him. They make multiple phone calls. They called to the National Guard. We don't have any hoist-capable aircraft. So lo and behold, it comes to the airstay. So we're looking at it. We're going, carefully looking at the area going, okay, this is like relatively narrow area on the Schuylkill River. And it's kind of hard to sort of, this isn't the standard stuff that we would typically do. And so we're looking at it, we're going, okay, we anticipating a couple of different things, but it seemed relatively straightforward. We're going to pick them up here. We'll take them over to Northeast Philly, drop them off there. Shouldn't be that bad. So as we're getting up in there, it's overcast, and what I think we hadn't anticipated, and which started to make sense to me as we were getting into there. And one of the things that I loved in flight school was the whole flight physiology section that we do. So pilots spend an entire week studying flight physiology. And the whole point of it, for the most part, is to teach you to trust your instruments. Because spatial disorientation is what will kill you in a heartbeat. And in your orientation in space is a combination of your vestibular system, which is your inner ear, as well as visual cues and gravitational sensation. So that gravitational sensation is generally oriented for us to be in 1G and generally moving somewhere in a horizontal plane, no more than usually 5 miles an hour or so, give or take.
Okay.
So take somebody who now is traveling at 120 miles an hour and taking in all sorts of different visual cues than they're used to, you can very quickly become spatially disoriented. So as we were making our approach down into the river gorge, and we're coordinating comms and things like that, the pilot I'm flying with says, whoa, like all of a sudden it's like it gets, the number one thing that when things are going wrong, things get quiet.
Uh-huh.
So that's like, that is a red flag. Or it's just, all of a sudden, when there's a regular banter conversation and that conversation all of a sudden stops, you need to start asking yourself, okay, what's going on? And as we were coming down into the gorge and we had the strobes on, what we were getting reflection coming off of the water, off of the walls on the side of the river, and reflecting back up into the main rotor system we're getting flicker vertigo, or the pilot was starting to get flicker vertigo. So, because we would normally have a strobe on, and that's going off once every second or so. And so it's reflecting on the gorge, it's reflecting on the side, it's coming up into the rotor system, and they become very disorienting. So quickly reach over, pop off shut off the strobes. I think the other thing that may have been contributing is we're moving forward and the river is also moving towards us. Yeah. And it's sort of like a runway effect. So you're normally like looking at it like as if you were coming in towards like a runway, and we're used to sort of having like a little bit more static approach. But I think what it was also starting to do is give this sensation that we were driving down in towards the river when we really weren't, So it required us to sort of step up our instrument scan a bit and make sure that we're not descending and we're maintaining a steady altitude. The big thing that I think made things easier was getting the strobe light off. And then we get stable over, and we pass the controls back and forth so that in between, I'm the safety pilot for this mission. So between hoist, I would take the controls so the pilot flying could, or the pilot in command that I was with, could actually, have a brief break for a second and then, pass the controls back to him so that he could come back in and do the next hoist. Because we had we did a total of basically 5 hoists. 1 to put the swimmer down, then 3 basket hoists for each of the survivors or the people on the boat. And so it's the boat stable, and that's here's the other thing. Car, yeah. So, we're coming in and we're hitting, we get the swimmer down. He radios back up to us, says, okay, we're going to get the first girl. We get her loaded up into the basket. She comes up. And I'm trying to remember if we used the basket or the strap. I want to say, I think we used the basket.
If the swimmer stayed down, you absolutely use the basket.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, if the only way that we would have used the strap is if the swimmer was coming up with him.
Right.
So, anyway, so we get the first girl up, get the second girl up, and then and we get the first girl up and the second girl up. Well, in the time that the first girl had come up, all of a sudden the cell phone rings, and the guy's trying to help the swimmer, and the guy's cell phone rings, and the guy's trying to help his help the swimmer managing the hoist and everything like that, I guess. And so he hands the cell phone to one of the girls. And it turns out that the phone call was coming from the guy's wife. But it's this girl that's answering, and you're hearing this helicopter hovering overhead. And so the girl briefly explains that, well, we're stuck in a river and we're getting hoisted up by the Coast Guard, and he'll call you back later. And the message to him was, tell him not to bother. So anyways, we get, we go through the hoist, we get the 2 girls up, the guys up, the swimmers recovered, fly over to Northeast Philly, drop them off. The police are there to meet the girls, and they, readily, transport them back over towards, Philadelphia, where they got picked up. And then of course they're talking to the guy who drove them into the river. And he sort of looks at us and he goes, do you think you can give me a lift to this other airport closer near my home? And we're like, nope.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Uber. I don't think we had Uber then, but call a taxi. So,
God.
It was a good case, but it was, of course it's at night, it's sort of narrow confined area. You've got all sorts of, these terrain features that, are very easily to sort of disorient you. And you kind of just have to adjust your game plan a little bit.
Right.
But, it worked out well. And it was, there's actually a couple, I'll have to look it up, but there's a couple of newspaper articles on the case. Or at least more about trying to recover the car, which I thought was pretty funny. So,
hey, if you could send it to me, I would love it.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely. I remember seeing those. So,
okay.
So anyway, so there's that case, which was kind of interesting. So,
oh my gosh, I was able to get the news article that John was talking about. It's on the UPI.com in their archives, dated July 1, 2002. The article headline says 3 rescued from disabled car boat. The article reads like this. Atlantic City, New Jersey, July 1. 3 New Jersey residents were rescued early Monday after their car boat became disabled near a dam in the Delaware River, the U.S. Coast Guard said. The 3 boaters had been rescued from the river by the helicopter. The New Jersey State Police is investigating the incident. This night rescue was very challenging. The amphibious vehicle was stuck in the rapids, and the area was relatively narrow with a tree height of 30 to 40 feet. But the important thing is that we were able to rescue all 3 people, said Lieutenant John Hall. The Coast Guard says the 3 victims were rescued and taken to Trenton Mercer Airport, where police questioned them. Despite their traumatic experience, all 3 boaters were in good condition.
I'm Brian Bosser reporting. An amphibious car has been stuck in the middle of the river near the Wing Dam in Lambertville for over a week. Today, crews were working hard to recover it from the rocks. Last Monday, Bill Sykes from Mays Landing was giving thrill rides on the Delaware River in his unique amphicar, a curious vehicle that has a dual life as a car and a boat. But that night he got a little more than he bargained for. The current swept the amphibious car and its passengers into the rocks, leaving them stranded. Rescue crews worked through the dark to save them from the rushing water, but the car was left behind. That is, until today, 9 days later. Salvage crews spent all Wednesday putting together a system of pulleys, floats, and ropes to attempt to recover the car. Bill's friend and fellow Amphicar owner, Chris Skeels, drove from Canton, Ohio last night to help his buddy.
He's helped me out in the past, and when we heard of his predicament, why a bunch of us club members put together a fund to try and raise some money to help out here, but I'm basically here to lend moral support and, of course, put a little sweat equity into it as well.
Chris says his friend Billy, known as the Splash King, was in the same Amphicar fan club with him, and they both appear in a special Amphicar calendar. The question is, where do these strange cars come from?
Well, it's a German amphibious vehicle. It was made between 61 and 67. About 3,500 were produced, and around 400 have survived. So they're a real rare car, but a lot of fun. You drive it down the road, does about 70 miles an hour on the highway, and you drive it right on into the water. About 7 knots on the water. It was competitively priced against the Corvette. In 1961, the Corvette cost about $3,800, and that's the price of this car new. But of course, I think they've appreciated a little bit since then.
And that's probably why these Amphicar enthusiasts are going to so much trouble to save Billy Sykes' Blue Wonder. Reporting in Lambertville, Brian Bossler, WZBN News.
Well, all right. So I got to bring you to another one. Thank you for sharing that one. You earned another one, which was a team ribbon, but this is
odd in that it's usually, we don't usually give out team ribbons for like a SAR case,
right?
But because of the unique nature of this case, it sort of turned into being, because it wasn't like a super no one case was a significant case in and of itself, but it was the collection of all of them and the trying to manage everything else. I'll let you just sort of run with that, but that's sort of the setup for it.
All right. Well, I'm going to I'll do my best to piece this together because there's a reference to the Coast Guard boat and the Coast Guard helicopter. So here's what it says. The Commandant of the Coast Guard takes pleasure in presenting the Coast Guard Meritorious Team Combination to Coast Guard 41419, that's the motor lifeboat, and the CGNR 6581, that's the helicopter, Sector Field Office Atlantic City Operations Center, so the Ops Center. Citation, for exceptional meritorious service on 15 October 2005, while performing operations in support of the search and rescue of 3 persons from Delaware Bay waters, acting quickly on the report of 2 ice chests full of food, freshly caught fish, and crabs floating in the Delaware Bay, Sector Field Office Atlantic City's duty officers and communication watch centers established the available information in a timely and efficient manner to swiftly deploy resources to the reported debris. Upon receipt of the search action plan from Sector, the Coast Guard Reserve motor lifeboat and the Coast Guard helicopter departed the station Cape May and Atlantic City Air Station Atlantic City en route to the area. Once on scene, the crew of the motor lifeboat promptly established a search, provided within minutes had located the additional debris and 1 person in the water. The individual had been in frigid water for over 7 hours and suffering from hypothermia. The crew of the motor lifeboat expertly performed basic first aid, relieving the man's symptoms. Displaying professional judgment, the crew also provided valuable information back to Sector and the Coast Guard helicopter, identifying additional individuals unaccounted for. Using this information, the helicopter crew modified their assigned search and immediately discovered the remaining 2 men safe on the beach. Once located, the helicopter crew proficiently hoisted the 2 men from the beach and the other from the deck of the motor lifeboat, rapidly transporting them to the awaiting emergency medical services. As a result of the combined professional and highly exempt crews of the motor lifeboat and the helicopter crew, and the expert search communications management of Sector, these 3 men are alive today. The dedication, pride, and professionalism displayed by the motor lifeboat, the helicopter, and Sector are in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Coast Guard. That's a great little write-up for that. And it's kind of funny. You and I had mentioned it, but team awards are like, whatever. You get them. I think I got a handful, couple, 2, 3, 4, whatever. But and actually some of them I didn't even do anything for. It was a unit that got it. It was a team award for the unit. So it's really cool write-up for what you guys did. So hit me.
So that one, I was senior duty officer. It was a boat that rolled over and had 3 people in the water, and one person was recovered, and it was multiple sorties. So one, our first B0 crew goes out, they didn't find anything. They came back. Second crew goes out, which was me. Okay, so it was multiple sorties, and it was that third sortie that, as we all of a sudden got this additional information, and I can't remember exactly what it was. And I remember what our assigned search pattern was, and that it appeared that the winds and wave action out of this storm that had rolled through, that had capsized the boat, were probably stronger than what and as well as they probably had more time in the water than we had been anticipating. So we adjusted the search pattern, and so it basically expanded it a little bit and increased the track line or track spacing, I think, and ended up finding them relatively quickly. So it was one of these things where talking to the air state and going, okay, and having done this now, I'm like 5 years in, it's my 5th year doing this, that I felt comfortable enough that, okay, I know what they assigned me for the search pattern. And here's the other thing is that we're co-located with our SAR planners. So, and we talk with them all the time before we go and fly. So it's like, so I know what they're thinking, and I know how they've based their search pattern off of. And we also know what it's like when we get there. And so sometimes we make small adjustments, but this was a little bit more than a small adjustment, but it, expanded the pattern. And like within the third or fourth track leg, we're like, boom, there they are. So it was cool. It was like, actually, it was like, okay, the science behind search, and it's so less sexy than the rescue part. It's so cool to put a swimmer down, and it's so cool to be able to hoist somebody out. But when you sit down and you look at how the Coast Guard has evolved and evolved the science of search, it's amazing that we have. And we've developed software that backs this up, and it's so complex. It's based on time, what type of vessel it is, how long it's been in the water, and all of the different adjustments that get made and the thought process that goes behind it. And what is, I think the most undersung heroes of Coast Guard search and rescue are our search and rescue planners that are sitting in the operations center day in, day out, generating search patterns. And when you look at some of these more complex searches that were done, you sit there and you're like, there's like a bazillion patterns in there, and you're kind of going, and they take into account what's been done and what needs to be done.
That's cool.
And as a senior duty officer at an air station where you've got 2 helicopters and you've got your SAR planner right there, there's one of the things that the Coast Guard is so good for, and that we're recognized for, and this is what allowed us to fucking kick ass in Katrina.
Yeah.
No pun intended, is that we decentralize our leadership. We empower the leaders at the base, at the very bottom, and they're the ones on scene. You can make a decision. And this is why all of the pilots actually go through SAR fundamentals and, also so additional search and rescue training, in terms, so that we understand what these patterns actually are, what they're doing, how we can use them. And this is where sort of my experience from the Merchant Marine Academy, understanding navigation, understanding, set, drift, and all of that stuff, I'm able to apply that. I had one other case where I flew.
Wait a minute. I'm not done with this one yet, because we're going to get into that. But and there's a reason I'm not done with this yet, and it's because at the end of this case, you guys received. This is why this like meritorious team, like again, meritorious team is like, oh yeah, that's cool. Hey, thanks for the ribbon for my uniform.
Yeah.
But, and this means more to me than anything else, is when we get a letter from the family. And this is what the letter says. May 19th, 2005. John Hall, how do you begin to thank someone for saving your life? You and your entire crew saved us Friday, April 22nd, 2005, 6 p.m. We lost the engine power for our boat. Boat U.S. Towing Service Delaware Bay launched, told us they were unable to assist us. High tide was upon us and plummeted our boat against the jetty in Delaware Bay, Mispillion River, Delaware. We had to abandon our boat. You answered our mayday, airlifted us from the beach, and took us to an awaiting ambulances in Cape May. I was in fear of losing my husband and father trying to save the boat. You and your crew risked your lives to help us when no one else could or would. We will be forever thankful. Here is a little something from my 85-year-old dad, my husband, and me. I'm sorry that I didn't know your proper title, but you will always be our guardian angel. May God bless you always. Respectfully, Sue, John, Howie. Dude, that is awesome. Oh,
for me,
awesome.
What I will tell you is, for me, that is, above the achievement medal. Anything I've gotten from, there's a one or two other things that sort of, more things that I've either had patients come and tell me in my clinical experience afterwards, but that's something that's going to be framed and on my wall for the rest of my life.
I hope so.
And when I was in clinical practice as what a lot of people don't necessarily know is this actually progresses on to me becoming a nurse practitioner and a primary care provider. And for the 8 years that I was a primary care provider, this sat on the wall. And it was surprising the number of patients who would come into the room and actually go up and read that. And on probably about 12, maybe 15 different occasions, I walked into the room, and before I ever said a word, they hugged me. So, and
it's pretty awesome.
They said they knew I was in the Coast Guard, but they didn't really understand what it meant, I think is what they were sort of getting at. But
yeah.
What I will add, that one the one that you just read, stems from a three SAR cases that were running simultaneously for a microburst that blew through the Delaware Bay.
Yeah.
And I found that, I ended up, this was another case where I modified the search pattern. So we had flown our search pattern, and I had looked down, and I probably had about another 20 or 30 minutes worth of fuel. And so I had, plus 30, and I sort of called back to the ops and I said, the way I was looking, the way I know the storm rolled through, we were still further up the Del Bay than I thought they really were. And so I said, can I expand and can I do a shoreline search? So basically I called back to the ops and I said, can I do a shoreline search checking the southeast quadrant of our search area and extending it a little bit further? So basically, knowing that the winds were rolling out of the northwest and coming down towards the southeast and pushing, if this boat became disabled, it would have been pushed down in this direction. So they got pushed up onto a jetty. So we came out of our search pattern, we're moving our way down, and as we're coming down, quite lit, and it was starting to get dark, and we didn't know that, we did not know that they were in contact with Towboat US or anything like that. So I don't know how that played out, but quite literally we came down, sort of saw this jetty, and I turned, out to sort of follow the jetty. And sure as hell, there's this boat sitting at the end of the jetty, 3 people standing on the jetty. And it was like, okay, it's like, okay, rescue check part 2. And it's, pulling it into a hover and, get the swimmer ready. And we, put the swimmer down, 3 basket hoists, get the swimmer back, run them over to Cape May. And, it was like how it's supposed to play out. Yes, we flew the search pattern, and they, like every other person that I ever brought back, indicated that they saw us multiple times before we saw them.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Because, as I had alluded to, I did accident investigations before. So I'd like to go back and ask questions of the people that we brought back. And it was not uncommon for me to say, go back and ask them, how did this, how long did it take us to find you, or did you see us beforehand? Every person that I brought back said that, yeah, we saw you 2, 3, 4 times beforehand.
Right on. Yeah.
Yes, that kills me because
it's
I look
searching
at
for a
it through the
basketball
lens.
in the water. Like,
Yeah, exactly. And I've used that analogy. I don't know how many times. You're literally looking for a basketball in the water.
Yeah.
And
Like,
take a
not a small
basketball
body of water.
No, I mean take a basketball, and like we usually fly the search patterns around 500 feet.
Yeah.
Take a basketball and put it 500 feet away from you and tell me how big it is.
Yeah, exactly. It's tiny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
And
looking
then-
for a
and then
needle in
you're-
a haystack.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, and then all of a sudden you add a couple of waves in it, a few white caps from time to time.
Right.
It is,
And
it
you're
is
moving.
not easy. Yeah. It is not easy to find.
Yeah.
The other thing I'm going to throw about this in particular team award is that it goes to show the amount of assets that we are willing to, or the U.S. Coast Guard is willing to put towards helping those in need. It is incredible to me. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And everybody's training that gets into that. Like all the aircrew training, all the boat training, all the comms training, and everybody having to work together to make that happen. Incredible. Oh God, I love what
this
we
is
do.
this is what makes the Coast Guard the unsung heroes. I mean, I love all of our other services. There's no question about it. I love my Marines. I love my Air Force, my Navy, but there is something about a United States Coast Guardsman. There's a common thread that binds all of us together, and it's unspoken. But it is, it's what drove me into the Coast Guard. It's what's driven me through my entire career, as an aviator, as, a paramedic, as a healthcare professional, it's what actually has connected me into your podcast to the point where I'm like completely addicted to it.
Well,
So-
thank you for joining me to share your stories, and thanks for listening.
I hope I'm not. The one thing I'm hoping I'm not boring you with all this crap. But
You're not boring me. I mean, I'm. This is why I do this. This is why we keep going. Look, you and I are like 2.5 hours in right now. I can't get enough.
I know. It's like I don't think I've ever gone this long.
We're gonna divert real quick to thank our sponsors. Ready Bar, originally made for astronauts, now designed for first responders and built for you. This high-performance meal bar provides complete nutrition without the sugar crash. A must-have for any helmet bag, swimmer bag, or everyday pack. Get yours today at getreadybar.com and use the promo code RESQ10 for 10% off. Ready Bar, zero crash, all fuel.
So I mean, it was so on the podcast that I sort of helped co-produce and where I came on.
Let's shout that out real quick. So you
Okay.
are part of another podcast. You run it,
Yep.
you guys. It's called So There I Was, and
Yep.
that podcast is all about. It's like you and 2 or 3 fighter pilots, and it's just guys that want to get around and talk fighter stories. And next thing you know, you get a couple other ones.
It's more aviation stories, and we've had a boatload of helicopter pilots on board. So, and the whole premise is that all.
I gotta say, I was privileged to be on. So thank you for having me as a guest.
We brought Quinny on to share his Coast Guard rescue swimmer stories, and they were epic. And you need to come back because you have more that we still haven't touched on. But so the whole premise of that podcast is it's stories about aviation, and and it's more like sitting around the bar sharing stories like, oh well, and we seem to find that the common thread was that all great aviation stories start with "so there I was," and in a way all great aviation, all great rescue stories start that way, or sometimes the great medical stories start that way. There was this one patient, this one event that happened.
This one time when this guy rolled into the ER and
right. And you think that in a way you kind of think, okay, we're just swapping stories and shooting shit. But the reality is that we're sharing lessons learned. And, I've learned a lot from other, I have gotten to where I am in my life because I stood on the shoulders of giants. There were people who took the time to recognize that I wanted to do something more with my life than just, fly helicopters or help people. And they took the time to make an effort. And, Captain French, he obviously gained nothing out of taking me to the Admiral of Health and Safety, but he believed in what I wanted to do, and he supported me in that respect. And, and every single commanding officer I've ever worked with, they supported and understood what I was trying to do. And I'm eternally grateful for that. I wouldn't have gotten to where I'm at with emergency medicine at this point, and, working in an ER, and seeing super sick patients, without having the guidance and support and mentorship of people who have gone before me. And, our rescue swimmers are the same way. I mean, when you think about your rescue swimmer training, they beat the hell out of you. But you know what? You're doing that because of where it's going to put you at the end of the process.
Right. Yeah, they have to know you're not going to quit.
Right. And there's, you hit on that in a recent episode of yours, or not too recent, but where you had the basically what I'm going to call the old guard back. You had Master Chief Farmer, and some of the real old school rescue swimmers. And not to call them old school, because I'm getting close to being old school myself. But, and they talked about how the Navy came back to them and said, what is it that you guys are doing? Why are the Coast Guard rescue swimmers not quitting?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they got Navy swimmers, apparently, that are quitting in the middle of a rescue.
Yeah. So that was said on the podcast. I can either confirm nor deny that.
Right.
I just know that they've come to us, and they've come to the Coast Guard. The Navy Rescue Swimmer School has come to the Coast Guard and said, what are you guys doing that's different than us? And they do student or instructor on student hitting in the pool. And I say grappling in the pool. And Navy Rescue Swimmer does not do that. I don't know about currently, but from what I understand, they do not, which is a difference.
And what I think that points to is and what I can sort of point to in my own clinical experience, when I've got a super sick patient in front of me, I don't have the option to back up and go, I can't do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've got to continue to work the problem until it's fixed or resolved, or resolved, or we're done. And that's, in that mindset of, I'm not going to give up on this, is something that's stick-to-itiveness, and that inability to, it's not accepting, I don't want to say it's accepting failure, but it's, that inability to like you said, like you had said on the end of your podcast with us, so there I was, don't give up.
Yeah, don't quit.
And it's,
just don't
and the
quit.
thing for me, it was always, I never imagined myself failing and, or not reaching the goal or objective that I set, and some might say, well, you didn't, because I didn't get picked up for lieutenant commander. And that's what sort of exited me out of the Coast Guard and sort of led to the second portion of my career path. But that was somewhat by design, because it actually enabled me to get a severance package, and then enabled me or facilitated me to transition out from the Coast Guard to then becoming a registered nurse, and from a paramedic to a registered nurse to then a nurse practitioner, which was a 12-year process. And, and it was sort of, it was hard. It was, believe me, I look back at my Coast Guard days, and I'm so grateful of what I did and what I accomplished. I stood shoulder to shoulder with some amazing aviators, amazing rescue swimmers, and, one thing I'll say about our flight mechanics as well, because we haven't talked about them. There is not a day that I walked out to the helicopter where I was not going, the maintenance on this aircraft is phenomenal, and where I was ever in question about the quality of the maintenance. And I brought my father-in-law, who's now really like my dad, out to see, the helicopter. And, when he would come down and visit. And he was amazed. He came out, he flew in, he was in the Army for a little while. He'd seen Army helicopters. He took one look at the Coast Guard helicopters and he just looks at me and he goes, "You could eat your lunch off of the floor of the deck of that helicopter." And I was like, "Yeah, but I wouldn't recommend doing it because they'll shoot you," but and he was just amazed at, the quality of maintenance. And what was funny was I took him over to one of the toolboxes and, I got, talked to the maintenance officer and I said, "Can I get a key?" They were very, persnickety about like they almost came with me when they gave me the key to the toolbox. And you know why. Yeah. But I brought him over to the toolboxes and I pulled out like the drawers of the toolboxes. Now I said, "Look at every single tool that's in here. Every tool has its place and every tool is accounted for." And that's because not a single friggin' tool needs to be left behind in the helicopter. And so the toolbox is signed out to the aircraft and to, whichever petty officer is there. And it's like double checked so that tools don't get left behind.
Yeah.
And
it's QA'd when it's open. It's QA'd when it's closed.
Right.
And every tool will be accounted for.
Those are the little moments in, that don't get talked about in Coast Guard aviation that to me are like, because like when I then think about those processes, I want to bring those processes into healthcare. Because that's where we're going to reduce medical error and make things safer and have better patient outcomes. By comparison, we are sloppy in healthcare. And I hate to say it,
No, I mean, it's an accurate statement. But I mean, yeah. So I'm not in it right now. So I not directly involved with it too much. So I can't. I speak from what I saw before. There are a couple things I would be like, that might want to change that. But I mean, outside of that, I mean, I've always been in the air and doing air ambulance stuff more than anything else. I did a little time in the ER. I did a little time in ICU, but for the most part, I've been in the air, and everything that we did in the air was very on point. We had a very good system in every place I've ever worked. So it's been cool.
So I do have like one other Coast Guard case that I think would be worthwhile talking about.
Let's do it.
That, this was actually, and I want to say this is like my one true bona fide, classic Coast Guard. I mean, no awards came out of it. It wasn't that difficult of a case, but it stands out to me in a couple of different ways. So this is actually over near Townsend's Inlet in New Jersey. And there's it's at night. I want to say, it was close to like 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Small John boat went out earlier in the day to go fishing. And they had an engine failure while they were trying to make their way back in, and not the most experienced seamen. And apparently they made the decision to then throw an anchor over the side, and they anchored themselves by the stern with the tide coming in. And so you can imagine relatively quickly how badly that decision went. And so there's 3 people on board. One guy's actually stuck in a wheelchair. Or confined to a wheelchair. Don't ask me how this is just one of these things where, remember how I alluded to like shit magnet? Another guy is 350 pounds, or at least 350, if not 400 pounds. And then there's a kid on board who's like maybe all of 75 pounds. And I'm just thinking to myself, as I started getting like more pieces of information fed to me as I'm going out to go, try and pick these people up, I'm thinking, this is almost like a setup for a joke. Like 3 people sitting there's 3 people on a boat, one in a wheelchair, and another guy weighs 400 pounds, and another guy who's, there's a kid who's, 80 pounds. And so anyway, so we get out there relatively quickly, and, we actually, unfortunately, the person in the wheelchair is not to be found. So but the big guy and the kid managed to get on a little sandbar. But the sandbar is closing in around them relatively quickly. So relatively quickly put the swimmer down, and he gets the little kid into the basket. Actually, I think we opted not to. I think we did a sling pickup with the 12-year-old because I think the swimmer wanted to have control of the kid and was reluctant about putting him into the basket on his own. So he came up, we put the swimmer back down. Swimmer I think had a hard time getting the strap around the big guy. So now we're trying to hoist the swimmer and this is actually almost kind of funny, swimmer and this big guy up, and because he wasn't going to fit in the basket, regardless of how hard we tried. And all I remember is like, and it's night and it's kind of now getting stormy, and all of a sudden I'm starting to pull, I hear the flight mat coming in. Okay, easy right, all right, hold position, taking the load. Like you hear him, like the helicopter tilts. He kind of like, you hear this accentuation in his voice, and it's all because of we're taking a 400-pound load. And you hear the hoist shift into like low gear as we're trying to hoist both this big guy and the swimmer up. And I'm sitting there pulling, and I know
you're almost maxing out the hoist. That's 600 pounds. Like you're close.
Yeah.
Boom.
It was, we get him up, and and then I think it was the next almost day and a half, we were searching for the guy that was on the John boat, that was in his wheelchair. And we ultimately found him. I think it was about 2 days later, sort of stuck in a tributary, and he had succumbed to his injuries, but there was two lives saved out of that one. So
wow, man.
So, there were some good cases there before I moved on. So
John, thank you for sharing all of them. This has been incredible. Yeah. So it's been fun. I've enjoyed this.
But, what ultimately ended up happening with me was, so I ultimately got out of the Coast Guard. Ultimately got passed over for lieutenant commander. Like I said, that was somewhat by design. I ended up getting hired by Atlantic City Medical Center. Went in to do basically mass casualty type planning. There's some inside stories there. This is part of what's called the New Jersey EMS State Task Force. So I did that job for about 10 months until I kind of became concerned about how funds were being managed, but then also decided that I really wanted to be more clinically engaged. So I wanted to be more at the bedside of a patient. So I did about a year and a half of critical care transport with Atlantic City Medical Center. By that point, I had finished my RN. So I was a registered nurse at that point, then got hired into an emergency room up in New Jersey, or from New Jersey we had moved to New Hampshire. So I'm working on the New Hampshire Seacoast. I did that for about 8 years. My last 3 years in the ER, working full-time night shift, I did grad school for my nurse practitioner, which was insane. That brings like trying to drink through a fire hose to a whole new level. Because I would do a 12-hour night shift, come off shift, go do clinical, then, sleep for a few hours, do another 12-hour night shift, go to class, then sleep for a couple hours, go do another 12-hour night shift, come off that, and then go do, probably actually study or work on a paper or something, have 2 nights off and like 3 more 12s, still working in classes and clinical rotations to get all that done. But
you're a glutton for punishment, John. That's all there is to that.
That was, I ended up with pneumonia towards the end of that. And I was super sick. I was like the sickest I've ever been in my life. And when I went to go see my doctor, he was like, yeah, there's an explanation for this. And it's like, you haven't been sleeping, you're not eating, you're not taking care of yourself. And it was a bit of a wake up call. He's like, I know that you think that you can manage all of this. He's just like, but you need to take some time to sort of get better.
Yeah, right on.
So it set me back a little bit. It was a bit of a message there. There was one other story. I got launched out for a Boy Scout that was jumping up and down on the bow of a whale watching boat. And he had jumped up as the bow was coming up. And as the bow came down, now the bow's not there. And so it went right over him. And so this kid's, he's 12 or 13 years old. He had been told once or twice by adult leaders there. He's a scout, in fact. And so he'd been told once or twice not to go and do that, but he still went ahead and did it, but he's 12 or 13, I'm not going to fault him for being a 12 or a 13-year-old kid. And it's one of these days where it's like kind of overcast and it's early spring. So you got that marine layer again, and the field's reporting VFR. So we launch out, load up, launch out, take off. And I'm figuring, okay, I can hit the special VFR route coming out of Atlantic City, which is a route that we would follow by looking at ground, things that we can see on the ground. And as I'm getting towards the perimeter of the field, and the further I get away from the field, the ceiling is coming down, the visibility is coming down to the point where I'm down at 200 feet and a quarter-mile visibility. And all I can see at this point is, as I'm, flying the VFR route, is a cell phone tower. And I'm in the right seat, so I grab the cell phone tower, and I realize, I'm not going to be able to make it to get feet wet completely. And I'm going to have to go back to the tower. And, this kid's in the water. So I've got this urgency in my head, but I make this 180-degree turn, sort of like a pirouette around the cell phone tower, to the point where I know I briefly looked over and I could actually make out the license plate numbers on the cars on the southbound lanes of the Garden State Parkway.
Wow.
And spin around. I go back to Atlantic City, put the helicopter, and meanwhile, my co-pilot's now actually calling the tower and telling them, I tell them, okay, get us an IFR clearance. So we do, and we get back, we get to the approach end of the runway. I don't even think we put the wheels down, and tower was great. They just gave us this IFR clearance, launch us down towards now Cape May, which is where we're headed. And so we do climb up over the clouds. It's a really low cloud deck. So we get up on VFR on top, now get over where we need to be, shoot an ILS down to Cape May, get below the cloud deck, and now I'm feet wet over, in the Del Bay. And unfortunately, when we got to the search area, we did not get to the scout. Somebody already dived in after him. But the whole reason why I sort of told this story is because when I had first qualified as an aircraft commander, our operations officer pulled me aside, and he sits me down. He goes, "What's the hardest maneuver to do in a Coast Guard helicopter?" And I'm thinking, okay, is it the hoist? Is it night? I'm going through all of this list in my head. And he goes, no. He goes, that's none of it. He goes, hardest thing to do in a Coast Guard helicopter, the hardest maneuver to do in a Coast Guard rescue helicopter is a 180-degree turn.
Huh.
And, what his point was, you're a search and rescue helicopter and you're going out to go rescue people. And I've got this young kid, and there's nobody more vulnerable than that. But I've also got 3 other people in the aircraft with me.
Right.
And if I go and ball it up, I now may have taken them out. They're going to tie up resources to deal with that. And, we train we have to go out, but we don't have to come back. But that's not the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it's old school mentality now.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was just, but it's also been one of those cases that, and we know how we talk about, at least in The Guardian, they talked about how you remember the ones you lost.
Yeah, totally.
So that boy's name is Nicholas Johs. Johs. He's from Staten Island, New York. And I'm not going to forget that.
That's deep, man. That's deep. Dude, I'm glad you shared that with me. Thank you.
And I still have wrestled with, could I have done something different? Should I have done something different? I don't think there was anything I could have done different, but, and could it have made a difference? I don't know, but it's tough, Yeah. And this is the shit that we have to live with
all the time. Part of the reason I do this podcast is therapy.
Yeah.
It's therapy for me too.
Yeah.
So,
I've
no illusion, man.
Yeah.
So
there's so much more to talk about, because if you wanted to go into more of the medical stuff, and as you can tell, my memory is pretty good on some of these things, but so I had one patient that came in from one of the local universities near us, who, and so this is where it's sort of, because there's no awards or anything that go with this, but there's one moment that goes with this that sort of sticks out. And that's, I had a young patient. She was 20 years old. She was at a university near us at the hospital that I work at. I'm going to keep some of these very generic and vague because I don't want to compromise patient information. She had taken about a 25 or 30 foot fall, and the weather that night was not great, so helicopters are not flying. She arrived into the ER probably around 9:30 or 9:45. very, very sick patient with respect to trauma. So she ended up with bilateral chest tubes, intubated, on a ventilator, a couple of different drips to help maintain her blood pressure, liver lac, splenic lac,
lacerations.
And so
not
I am, yeah,
or
like
the
all
lac,
sorts
sorry.
of, yeah, all sorts of internal injuries with lots of hemorrhage, transfused with probably 6 units of blood.
Wow.
So I was managing this patient basically one-on-one nursing care for probably 10 hours. So get her down to Mass General, transfer, and in this entire time, I don't even know her name. We don't even know. She's a Jane Doe. She literally is registered as a Jane Doe. It wasn't until 5 minutes before we got to Mass General that I finally got a name for the patient.
Wow.
And, so, this includes taking her to CAT scan, multiple liters of fluid, putting in chest tubes and catheters and, 2 large bore IVs. And just, it was literally that entire time from 9:30 until, about 6 o'clock or so when I transferred her to Mass General or so, like 100% full tilt. Like I was running my ass off that entire time.
Wow.
And, I've never worked so hard to try and keep one person alive for an extended period of time. And so this one has really stood out to me, because she had like intracranial hemorrhages, and there was from what I recall and hearing some of the backstory on her incident, a portion of her skull was taken out and then placed into her abdomen.
Wow.
So to keep it viable, so that they would then replace it later because she had so much intracranial swelling.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, but she survived. And, that was, I think, the coolest end point of it. But, I had worked in this ER
awesome.
for about 8 to 9 years. And I knew the staff that I worked with that night. We were pretty tight. And, and this is totally off out of the ordinary. So I walked back in after dropping this patient off, and because I'm coming back with the ambulance, and I walked through the door. I'm carrying 2 pumps and all this equipment and gear with me, and and it was pretty dead at that point. And as I'm walking through the door, it's like, I want to say it was like 7:45, and the nurse manager for the ER was there. Day shift was there because they were coming on shift. Night shift going off. Every single one of them stood up and started applauding.
Oh, wow. Wow. Oh, that's so cool.
And it was sort of like one of these moments where they said, we heard what you did. Like if they weren't there, they heard what they did. But I had never, like, it kind of, in a way, as far as being a nurse, it felt like that finally, like I finally had proven myself, that I may have known, and it was just one of these moments where you're like going, and it's like, I wasn't expecting any of that. And it meant more to me than any award or anybody patting me on the back or anything like that. It was just, it was like one of these moments where you go, okay, I must have done something right.
Yeah.
So,
you know what? If you don't mind, I'm going to end it right there, because that is just amazing. What a way to end like this epic podcast. This has been awesome, John. Thank you so much. I do have one more question before I let you go.
Sure.
I love that piece of advice. So if you had a piece of advice that you would pass on to everybody else that's doing the job or that could follow your career, what would it be?
So I love this question. And I honestly have a relatively simple answer for it. And that is, dare to be selfless.
Ooh, nice. I like that, dude. I like that.
If you ask me any one thing that has been a guide for me, I sort of think back to my time at the academy and acting on Verba and Semper Paratus. Always ready, deeds not words. But I entered into a service academy, not because I wanted to serve myself. And we live in a society where we want to, it's all about getting the clicks or the likes or the thumbs up or the pat on the back or something like that. But dare to be selfless, and if the one thing that I will say is, in the interim of some of this time period, from where I've been, I've also been a primary care provider, and I've provided healthcare to 2,000 patients. That was my patient panel size. And I think I made a big difference in some of those lives. And not because I wanted to feel great about myself, but because I wanted to be selfless. I wanted to take care of others.
That's awesome.
And when we think about so others may live, dare to be selfless.
Totally. Oh, John,
and that's
great.
why I've always felt such a bond or a connection. Like when I sit there and I look a Coast Guard rescue swimmer in the eye, I know exactly what they are. I don't want to say exactly what they're thinking, but I have that connection.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And that's what, that was the gift that I got out of the United States Coast Guard.
It's a good gift to have, man. Dude, John, thank you for the advice. Buddy, I cannot thank you enough for coming on. We have literally been on for like almost 3 hours. This is awesome.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for coming on our show. More than willing to come back anytime, anything that I can do. Hopefully I'm not boring.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. But no, one more shout out to your podcast.
So There I Was. You can find us at sothereiwas.us.
Which is a great podcast. You guys have like some great guests that I've had that you've had on. One of them, which I listened to, which was amazing, is a Vietnam vet. There was a pilot that like literally got his eyes shot out. He's got one eye and had to take off out of the LZ, getting people blinded. Amazing story. So
he was blind when he flew out of the LZ and was talked out of the LZ by his flight mechanic.
Literally putting his fingers on like torque and power, like because he broke out the glass. I don't want to
cape.
I don't even want to tell the story. Go listen to the podcast. It is incredible.
Yeah. So check us out at So There I Was. So,
John,
all right,
thank
Quinny.
you so much. I really appreciate it.
We owe you one, buddy.
And I look forward to getting together with you and having a drink and kicking back more stories.
Absolutely.
It's gonna be good.
Yeah.
Right on.
All right, man.
Later. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of here.
Go.
Now it's time for me to pull chocks and take off. But before I go, I'm always looking for the memorable rescues that people have done. If you have one that you're willing to share or know somebody who has a story, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to highlight it here at the Real Rescue. For everybody that is standing by for that SAR alarm, remember, those in distress are praying for a miracle. They are going to get you. So until next time, fly safe and swim hard. Thank you for joining me today here at the Real ResQ Podcast, powered by Vertical Helicast. We'd also like to say thank you to our sponsors for this episode.
Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, save lives, and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
Axnis. The Axnis P&G wireless ICS system delivers cutting-edge wireless ICS technology to any aircraft. As a fully integrated system or as a carry-on, carry-off mobile base station, the P&G wireless system is the right solution for any mission.
And
Centum, the creator of LifeSeeker. When every second counts in search and rescue, LifeSeeker turns mobile phones into beacons, guiding teams with precision even in remote areas. With a proven track record and hundreds of successful missions, it boosts success rates and saves lives. Learn more at Centum.com.
funniest training moment that you ever had?
Oh, well, it's not necessarily a training moment, but the funniest moment that I had was I was flying a Homeland Security mission for the Miss America pageant. And we're just basically turning jet fuel into noise after 9/11. And so I'm off of the coast of Atlantic City and I look down and we're our mission, report anything that's out of the ordinary, right?
Okay.
So I'm looking down and I see what literally I can identify it as a World War II landing craft. And I'm like, okay. And I take a second look at it, and on this World War II landing craft is an RV. And then I'm looking at it, and then I see, like, I'm on NVGs and I see a bright glow, and there's like, looks like they're grilling. So, you know, I kind of drop down, I take a second look, and I'm going, I'm like blinking and going, okay, one of these moments where I'm going, you know, this doesn't make any sense, you know, and I drop down, lower altitude, take a look. No, that's really what I'm seeing. And then swing back around again. I take another look and I go, holy shit, that is really what, and then the giggles kick in. So now I'm just laughing because, like, it's January. I'm doing this Homeland Security mission, and I'm supposed to now report in anything that's out of the ordinary. And I've got to call into the airstay with, you know, a Winnebago that's sitting on a World War II landing craft with a bunch of guys grilling hot dogs, it looks like. You know, so.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, you know, there was one other story, but